I want to thank everybody for coming out this morning. We're excited to hear from Dr. Garrett Best about the book of Revelation. I'm about to read his intro and some information about his background, and then John Langley, one of our ministers here, will lead us in a prayer, and then Dr. Best will come up and present for us. I hope you're ready to take a lot of good notes today. Dr. Garrett Best serves as the chair of the Department of Bible and Ministry at York University. He completed his undergraduate degree in Bible and Spanish at Freed-Hardeman University, his Master of Divinity at Harding School of Theology, and his PhD at Asbury Theological Seminary. His dissertation, which focused on the irregular Greek syntax of the book of Revelation, is currently being published with Brill. While working on his degrees, Best served in full-time ministry in 2 churches in Memphis, Tennessee, and Nicholasville, Kentucky for 13 years. Garrett is an avid pickleball player, which some of you can relate to that. He has been married to his wife, Robin, for 14 years. Their son, Jackson, is 9 years old and loves all things sports. And their daughter, Anna is 6.
Let's pray. Father, we're so thankful for opportunity to open our minds and our hearts to the Word, especially to the book of Revelation, since it's been a focus point for our nation for a long time. What I pray for, Father, is that we listen to hear truth, and I ask you to give Dr. Best his best in you, Father, for the blessing to come to us through understanding one of the important portions of your word. And we ask you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, it is really good to be with you this morning. And I'll go ahead and say that the title for our workshop today, Reading Revelation Responsibly, comes from a book. And I've actually told Mike Gorman this when I saw him. I said, you got the best name for a book ever, Reading Revelation Responsibly. Nobody will ever come up with a better name for a book, right? The triple R, it all goes together. And I do have to just say this. I mean, I am so impressed that you're out here on a Saturday morning to study the book of Revelation. Like, kudos to you. You know, this is awesome to spend. When he told me 111 were registered, I couldn't believe that. I was thinking 30. So this is awesome to see so many people out. With that said, we are going. I tell the churches that I preach at, some Sundays, depending on the text, I have to get up to church and say, you better put on your seatbelts today because we got to go fast. We got to go hard and fast. And we get one kind of couple hours together on a Saturday. How much can we really do, right? And I want to lead with, we can't do it all. And so I'm going to do as much as I can. I have about 290 slides for us to try to go through today. And that's me trying to give you as much as I can for a few hours that I'm with you today. But with that said, we won't be able to cover a whole lot. And so if you're looking for a book that you want to read to continue on, this is a great one. Reading Revelation Responsibly. I have that one. I have another one that I'd recommend to you. It's a little more advanced, but it's by Craig Kester called Revelation and the End of All Things. And if you want to look at these, they're up here because we can't do everything today. So I'm just kind of heading that off at the pass. The other thing to say is that I know that we all bring different backgrounds into this room with the book of Revelation. And I know some people in here have studied this for their whole lives and have all of these sort of firm opinions and thoughts and beliefs about the book of Revelation. And that may disagree with what I am going to say today. And so I would just ask you to refrain from throwing tomatoes or those large zucchinis out on that table out there, anything like that. And if you want to argue with me, I love a good, joust. And so if you want to have those conversations, let's do it. This will be over at 2, and I'll stay here until the wee hours of the morning if you want to, arguing with you about Revelation. I just want you to know that. So if you get angry about something, just let us try to get through our 290, and we can talk on our breaks or over lunch or something like that, if that makes sense. So that will save us from anything that might happen throughout our seminar this morning. In our first session today, what we're going to talk about is what are we reading and how do we read this book responsibly? Because this is kind of the key. How many of you have the experience reading Revelation and you're just totally confused at what's going on? Okay, that's, I think, most of the people who encounter the book. So it's important to start here. So if we're going to read it well, we need to know what we're reading. And I think that's really important. So that's where we're going to start. Did you know that there was a lost episode of VeggieTales that never made it to the TV? Did you know this? Do you know what VeggieTales are, right? It was the episode about Revelation, and they didn't want to put the burn-up vegetables on the TV and scare the children. This is totally a joke, you guys, okay? We can have fun. We can have fun together. You are allowed to laugh at our workshop. I mean, you're all sitting here like you're about to scare me or something. No, this is just fun. Come on, Saturday morning. Let's go, people. But I think what this little funny thing, I don't know who did this. This is AI, but I don't know who did this, but at least shows us this is how people, if you think about the book of Revelation, this is what you're thinking about. Armageddon. The rapture. Oh, the leftovers. The 4 horseradishes. The beast and the whore. This is a little, it didn't make it to TV, right? The fallen angels. The dragon and the prophets. Plagues and war. The last judgment, right? The New Jerusalem. And this is kind of, when we think about the book kind of in popular culture, this is sort of what we think about, right? The scary, the 4 horsemen. How about this? The 7-headed beast. What's happening in these images? What about 666, right? Major thing that we think about when it comes to the book. In fact, this Christian worker in Tennessee quit his job when his W-2 form from his company had 666 on it. And then he goes on to say that he got a higher paying job later, so God blessed him, because this is the kind of thing that I remember I went to the DMV when I moved to Memphis, and I needed to get a new tag, and the lady picked up a tag, and she looked at it, and she said, "We're not doing that today," and she threw it in the garbage, and I said, "Well, what did it say?" And she said it had 666 on it. And so even the DMV lady didn't want me to have 666 on my tag, which I thought would actually have been hilarious given that I study Revelation. I thought that would be very fitting. But we think about prediction of the end of times. This is sort of what the main book is about. We think about Left Behind. This is kind of a major, I would say this is the major way that people in America are approaching this book, with these sorts of things in the background. And these are major films with major actors, and so this is a major way out there reading the book. I have no idea who produced this, but sort of detailed end of times charts that are using passages from Revelation with passages from 2 Thessalonians 2 and Matthew 24 and all of these other, Daniel 9, kind of predicting what it's going to be at the end times, and sort of all these sorts of timeline charts. Are you familiar with the Branch Davidians and what happened in Waco? David Koresh set up a sect, a cult there, and he regarded himself as being the one who could open the 7 seals of the book of Revelation and bring about the end times, and essentially formed this group of people that were there. The FBI raided them in 1993, which resulted in a 51-day armed conflict, and more than 80 people, including Koresh, died in a fire on the compound. People have literally lost their lives based on how they've read the book and interpreted the book and the teachers that they followed. And so there are major consequences to how we read and interpret the book of Revelation. There was even a major series that was on Paramount about this conflict that happened in Waco. But I shared this with my students. I'm teaching Revelation now, and it's not just, the impact of this book is not just in cults in Waco, because if that film that we just talked about, Waco, and the events that happened there, we might think, well, these are sort of fringe things. But actually, this is in these ways of reading and engaging the text and the impact of Revelation. They've impacted our politics in this country at the highest level. I'll just use one example. Pat Robertson, who was a major player in starting the 700 Club and had a show for many, many years, just until 2023, sort of used the book of Revelation along with a bunch of other texts to talk about how sort of modern current events happening in our world were the fulfillment of prophecies that were made in the biblical text. And we watch some of these clips with our students, with my students, and it's sort of shocking sometimes to see some of the things that are there. But Pat Robertson is not just some guy on the TV. He ran for president, standing here next to George H.W. Bush. Here he is with Ronald Reagan on interviews. Here he is with Al Gore. Here he is with Jeb Bush. Here he is, exclusive interviews with Donald J. Trump. Here he is with exclusive interviews with Donald J. Trump. And if you watch his videos, he says, when I had supper with the president the other night and we had a few hours to talk about what the Bible is saying about the events that are taking place right now in the Middle East. This is not just some fringe thing. This is at the highest level. This is serious. And so I said all this to say that I think what we're doing today is serious. And I think it's important. And I think it's important that we read Revelation responsibly. Now, here's how I use the word responsible. I use responsible to mean this. I want to read this book in its historical context. It was written to 7 churches in Asia Minor, and I want to read it that way. I think that is a responsible reading of the book. I want to read it in its literary context. So, for example, just one brief little example that we've already seen. So the person who gets their tax return or their W-2 and sees 666 and then quits their job. Well, if we're actually reading the number 666 in context, which we're going to talk about today, I know we can't cover everything, but I figure you're interested in chapter 13 and 666, so we'll do that today. But specifically 666, it says it's the number of a man and it'll be written on the forehead or the right hand. That's not a tax return. Does that make sense? I mean, if it were on my license plate, it wouldn't be what Revelation 13 is talking about. Does that, you see what I mean, right? But that's, we just pull out 666 and sort of run with that. But a responsible reading says, I want to read it in context, in its literary context. I think a responsible reading of Revelation also, when John wrote this to these churches, there is something in here that they're supposed to do and keep. There's some message that they're supposed to get and go and live out. And so if we just read Revelation at this sort of intellectual level and we don't read it at the spiritual formational level, then I don't think we're reading it well either responsibly, because it's supposed to be, there is an application. There is something in this book that Christians are supposed to live out. Does that make sense? So what I mean by responsible is a reading that is historical, that is contextual, and that has relevance for the church, that it means something for the church that we're to live out. That's what I mean by that term, and that's what we want to do today. I want to briefly tell you about my story with Revelation, because I wonder if you'll all agree with this. There are some people who, if you ask people what their favorite book of the Bible is, and there's probably some in here today, because when you say a Revelation seminar, there are some people who are like, I spend my whole life in the book of Revelation. They just love it. But then there's the other side who just don't know what to do with it, so you completely avoid it. How many are in that camp? Right? That was me. Oh, sorry. Wow. Okay. That was me. I grew up at a church that I don't remember us ever talking about the book of Revelation. I think maybe we sort of sometimes might talk about the 7 letters to the 7 churches and be like, what would the Lord say to us? You know, something like that. That would be it. We didn't know what to do with the book either. We never talked about it. I never heard kind of anybody preach on it. I don't ever recall there being a class on it. And I was scared of the book. So I went to Freed-Hardeman University and I graduated with a double major in Bible and Spanish. Never took a class on Revelation. I'm sure one was offered, but I didn't take it. I go to Harding School of Theology, where we have a world-renowned scholar on Ephesus. And because Ephesus is one of the cities addressed in Revelation, he was a scholar not just on Ephesians, but also on the book of Revelation, and this famous class that he offered that everyone took, and I didn't take it because I didn't want to do Revelation. It was too scary, it was too confusing, all those sorts of things. So I get to my PhD program at Asbury, and the way this works is as a PhD New Testament student, they only offer one PhD seminar every semester in New Testament. Whatever it is, you just have to take it. And I was committed to taking whatever class Craig Keener offered because I wanted him to be on my dissertation committee. So whatever he offered, I was going to have to take. So I go to register for classes for one of the semesters, and I said, "You have got to be kidding me." Because Craig Keener is teaching Revelation at the PhD seminar, and I don't even know at that point that I'd ever really read or engaged the book. I'm going to have to figure this out. And so in one PhD seminar, I had to catch up on a lifetime of avoiding the book. And at the end of the course, we had to write a paper for that class, and he comes into the class, there's 13 of us, he's passing all of our papers back out. He said, "Everybody did well. There's 2 papers of these 13 that you need to continue on with this research because it's good and you need to keep going with it." So I get my paper back, and lo and behold, at the top it says, "You need to continue on with this research." And I said, "You've got to be kidding me. I can't get away from this book now." And so I ended up writing my dissertation on the book of Revelation, which means you have to take your comprehensive exams for your PhD program in the book that you're writing on, which meant I had to know everything that had ever been said about the book of Revelation, ever. And now, let me say that I love this book, and I will say something provocative that I'd like to draw out for the rest of the day with you. I think it is the most relevant book for our cultural moment. I think it is the most relevant book for our cultural moment. And that's a pretty provocative claim to make, right? I want to show that today. I hope that you leave today and go, wow, we need the message of this book. I've been to all of the cities, the 7 cities that are addressed in this church. I've been able to travel to Turkey, and now my wife and I help lead other people to go and have the experience of walking in the steps of John and walking in these churches themselves. And so I love the book. The first thing that we need to do when we talk about any book of the New Testament, not just the book of Revelation, we need to talk about what kind of genre is this. And that's a fancy word that just means what kind of literature is this. So here are some examples. If I open up a book and the first words in the book are "once upon a time," I'm not going to read that story and then run around and going, "Oh, are there real dragons eating damsels in distress in towers?" You know, it's like, I know that I'm reading something that's fictional. Does that make sense? And so getting the genre right is really important. If I turn on a movie and I confuse sort of an action movie and a documentary, I'm going to be very bored, right? Because these are different kinds of genres. All the time in interpreting the Bible, I have to teach students that we don't interpret poetry the same way that we interpret narrative. They're different kinds of things, and we have to understand what we're reading and what kind of genre it is. This is really important to know what kind of literature we're reading. I love this story. So H.G. Wells' novel, War of the Worlds. Are you familiar with that? So he wrote this. It's this fictional story, but in 1938 on Halloween, they thought it'd be great to read H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds over the radio. But they didn't say, they just started reading the story, and as people are listening to the radio, they're like, "Oh, aliens are invading New Jersey right now." And people started panicking, and halfway into the radio broadcast, the police have to bust into the recording studio and saying, "You're causing such a panic in the studio because people believe this is real," that they have to stop the broadcast and then come back on and say, "We're just reading a fictional book." We're just reading H.G. Wells' novel, because if you get the genre wrong, it can have a lot of consequences in how you hear it. Does that make sense? It's important to get the genre correct. Revelation actually has a couple of different genres, and so there are 3 parts to how Revelation works, and it's really important to get all 3 of these correct. Revelation is at once an apocalypse, it is also a prophecy, and it's also a letter. And the reason this is so important is because knowing that Revelation is an apocalypse is going to tell us how the book works. Knowing that it's a prophecy is going to tell us what it is doing. And then knowing that it is a letter is going to tell us to whom this genre is giving this message. Does that make sense? What we're going to do for the next couple of minutes is walk through these one at a time. And I think it's helpful to start with Revelation as letter. This is Ephesians. So remember, Ephesus is one of the churches, 7 churches in the book of Revelation. Look how a typical letter starts. This is Ephesians, and this is how it starts. The sender, Paul, identifies himself. He identifies his addressees to the saints who are in Ephesus. This is a typical greeting at the beginning of any letter. Grace and peace to you from God our Father, and then a blessing. Do you see this? Can you remember this? Sender, recipients, grace and peace, blessing. How does Revelation start? The sender, Jesus Christ, through the servant John. Do you see the blessing? Blessed and blessed. Do you see John to the 7 churches that are in Asia? And then do you see grace and peace to you? Do you see this? Revelation starts like a letter, and it looks like a letter. And you may go, well, duh, what's the big idea here? This is really important because what is in this book must be relevant to the 7 churches to whom it is addressed. Now, what this means is that, and I, with my students, this is the term I like to use. Exegesis is trying to read the Scripture and draw out of Scripture what its meaning is. Narcigesis is reading Scripture and making it all about me all the time. Does that make sense? Narcigesis is reading Scripture and reading as if it's all about me. And I think a lot of our issues with reading the book of Revelation would be if we try to read it as a message to those 7 churches in Asia Minor in the second half of the 1st century, and not as a message first and foremost to me, or, might I say, to modern day America. Does that make sense? Now, whatever relevance the book may have for modern day America, it first has to be a message to them before we can ask what this might mean to us. Are you with me? I think that's so important. But yet in practice, this is often not what happens. And not just with Revelation. How many Bible study groups or how many classes have I taught with students that you say, what does Paul mean in this passage? Or what does Peter mean in this passage? Or Luke mean in this passage? And the first words out of our mouth is, well, I think to me this means, that's just our inclination. We're narcigetes. And I think that's just how we know to read the text. But I want to hear it as a message to them. Okay? I think this is really important. Not only is the whole thing addressed to these 7 churches in Asia Minor, but then embedded within chapters 2 and 3 are 7 oracles specifically to these 7 churches. Does that make sense? Now, let me ask you all, can you all tell me about Thyatira in the second half of the 1st century? Tell me what you know about Laodicea in the second half of the 1st century. And the answer is nothing. We're reading a message to someone else that we don't know a whole lot about. Does that make sense? So to read it well, we're going to have to do some catching up. We're going to have to learn some things about Asia Minor in the 1st century world. So today we're going to do a little bit of that. I'm going to tell you some things that I think are crucial to understand the situation on the ground in these churches, but that you may not just be sitting there queued up in your brain somewhere. But that's how the book is. It's a message to them. What do we know about these cities? And this is just not just true for Revelation, it's true for the New Testament. We must understand any document in the New Testament, and today Revelation in particular, as a message to them before asking what it means for us. I think that's just good biblical interpretation. And I think this is a main problem with many modern readings of the book of Revelation. Because the way that many people read this is as if the entire message were directed towards modern day America and our specific geopolitical foes. That it's about Russia and China and some of these other things. And I don't read the book that way because it's a message to these 7 churches. And one of the litmus tests that I give people for reading the book of Revelation is if your reading of Revelation could not have made sense to someone sitting in a pew in Pergamum in the 1st century, it's not correct. Does that make sense? Because it has to be intelligible to the people who are receiving this and reading this. And to think that God embeds a message to modern day America to 7 churches who would have no reference of understanding what God is saying, I think is an interesting view of who God is and how He communicates His message to His people. I'm going to give them a message, but it's actually a secret code for another nation 2,000 years from now. Does that make sense? I just think that is, as I think about that way of reading the book, I just think we have to anchor the message and our understanding of the book within its first century context. Okay, so that's one. That's understands the letter. So important. Number two, prophecy. The book is prophecy. If John were standing here today and we said, John, what is this book you've written? How do we understand it? John would say, I've written a prophecy. How do we know this? He says it over and over and over and over. The words of the prophecy of this book. 22:7, the words of the prophecy of this book. He said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book. Chapter 22, the words of the prophecy. Are you with me? Right? Okay. He goes overboard. Prophet, 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 prophet. Chapter 10, verse 11, he sees his role after consuming the scroll as being to prophesy. He is apparently, chapter 22, verse 6, amongst a group, 22:9, he is amongst a group of prophets who are working within Asia Minor. He's around his brothers who are the prophets. This is a prophet giving a prophecy. So the next question is, well, what's a prophecy? And I asked my students in class this the other day, I said, what is a prophecy? And the answer that most people give is a prophet tells the future. Make sense, right? My guess is if I ask you today, this is the answer, I probably would have gotten at least several people in the room say prophets tell the future. I don't think that's right. Because one of the things that's characteristic of the book of Revelation is if I took this book, it's hardback, so I can't do it, but if it were softback and I squeezed this book a little bit, the Old Testament would come pouring out of it. This book is full, and the book of Revelation actually never fully quotes the Old Testament. It actually alludes to it, and allusions are harder to detect than quotations, so scholars debate about the number of allusions that are in the book, but there's somewhere between 300 and 600 allusions to the Old Testament in the book. There's 22 chapters. And these prophets, these are some of the most alluded to books in the book of Revelation. Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah, Zechariah, Jeremiah, Joel. Another book that we might mention in the prophets in the Old Testament is Jonah. And I'm going to use Jonah as an example. How much future telling's in the book of Jonah? In 40 days, it'll be overthrown. I just use that as an example because you're probably not queued up with Zechariah. Are you with me? But you're queued up with Jonah. Prophets don't do prophets don't do future telling, they do forth telling. They receive a message from God and they go and share that with usually either God's people or one of the enemy nations of God's people. You with me? Now, sometimes that message does involve future elements. I'm not saying there's never future elements to prophecy, but prophets receive a message from God and then they go and tell that to God's people as warning to say, you need to straighten up, or warning of judgment against God's. Does that make sense? It's not all future telling. Have you read Isaiah lately, or have you read Zechariah or Jeremiah? Some of it is future telling, but prophecy is not synonymous with future telling. The prophets in the Old Testament do judgment and hope. They go and issue warnings on behalf of God that judgment is coming your way if you don't straighten up. But they also issue hope that this will not be the end for you. Does that make sense? Right? And so if John were to say, what am I doing? I've written a book, just like the prophets, that conveys judgment upon God's enemies and hope for the people of God. That's what a prophet does. Did you know that the entirety of the book of Revelation is actually based on the structure of the book of Ezekiel? Did you know this? John conceives of himself as being Ezekiel 2.0. And in the Old Testament, why is that? In the Old Testament, the major enemy of God's people was Babylon. And in the book of Revelation, the major enemy of God's people is Babylon. Look at it. Revelation 14:8. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Where do you think that comes from? I have my class trained. So let's see if we can get trained today. If I ever say, where do you think that comes from? The class will all at once say, the Old Testament. And they're always right. They're always right. Almost always. But then when I say, okay, well, where is it in the Old Testament? And that's when they clam up. And that's okay. They've developed this reflex to realize that almost everything in the book comes from the Old Testament. And actually, by the way, I will say that would fix some of our orientations in the book, because most of us read this is how we engage. We look at Revelation and then we look to the future. But by embedding so many Old Testament scriptures and allusions to the Old Testament, John's actually telling us that our orientation needs to be the other way around. We look at Revelation, we need to look backward. Does that make sense? And so, look at this. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. This comes straight from Isaiah 21:9. And for the rest of Revelation, look at what it's going after. The great city, the great Babylon, Babylon the Great. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. The great city, Babylon the mighty city, Babylon the great city. Well, here's the problem with that. Babylon fell in 539 BC and has been gone for 600 years. Why is the book going after a nation, an empire that's not been around for over 600 years? Are you with me? Right? Why is it the target of Revelation? Why is so much about Babylon? Well, what was Babylon in the Old Testament? Remember, our orientation's got to be to look back. What was Babylon in the Old Testament? Well, it was the most powerful ancient nation in the ancient world. It was the supreme enemy of God's people in the Old Testament. The kings of Babylon encouraged idolatry. Think about the story of Daniel, right? If you don't bow down to the statue, right? Babylonian kings encouraged idolatry and required their subjects to worship the king. And the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BC. Now, you ready for my major, awesome PowerPoint skills? What are the characteristics of Rome in the New Testament? And not much change between these two slides. The most powerful nation in the world of these 7 churches is the empire under which they live, Rome. They are the enemy of God's people. The Roman emperors encouraged idolatry and required worship of the emperor, called the imperial cult. Rome destroyed the Jerusalem and her temple in 70 AD. Do you see it? You can call Rome Babylon because everybody's going to understand what this means, although Babylon's been gone for 600 years. Now, another way that we know this is because there are many other Jewish texts, and there's a reference to this in 1 Peter as well, calling Rome Babylon. So this is even in another place in our New Testament. But look at all these other texts that refer to Rome as Babylon. This is a common sort of Jewish first century way of referring to Rome by calling it Babylon. So in the same way that God's prophets comforted God's people in the past, John is comforting God's people in Asia Minor. Despite all the signs to the contrary, God is still in control and will bring an end to all evil and oppression. And in the meantime, prophets warn God's people not to compromise to the dominant oppressive system. Do not sin or commit idolatry while you're waiting on God to act while you're in Babylon. Does that make sense? That's what prophets in the Old Testament are doing. And that's what John would say he's doing if he were here. Let's go to the last one, because I think of all these, this one's the most important. Revelation as apocalypse. Where do we even get this name from? Why do we call this a genre, the genre of apocalyptic or apocalypse? This has now become a movie genre. I see this like on Netflix. It's like apocalyptic genre. And what are those movies all about? The end of the world. This is what it's come to mean sort of in English. But what we need to know is that in the ancient world, this is a reference to a particular genre that was there in the ancient world. The name for the genre actually comes from the first verse of Revelation. Revelation 1:1, the first words out of the gate for the book of Revelation is Apocalypsis Jesu Christu. And apocalypsis is the Greek word for, just means an unveiling or a revelation. So if you've ever heard anyone refer to this book as Apocalypse or Revelation, that's just the first word of the book. But what scholars did is they took that first word, apocalypse, an unveiling of something, and they have noticed that there are lots of these apocalypses in the ancient world. Does that make sense? There are many of these apocalypses in the ancient world. Here it is right here in Revelation 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's an unveiling. So I tell my students, can I show you an apocalypse? Ready? That's it. It's something is hidden from you, and an apocalypse pulls the curtain back to reveal it. And what Revelation is doing is saying there are cosmic realities that are happening in your world that you don't see. And what Jesus Christ, this is a revelation of Jesus Christ, what Jesus Christ is going to do in this book is pull the curtain back, drop the curtain. You know Wizard of Oz at the end when the curtain drops and you see who's really kind of pulling the strings on everything. What Revelation's doing for these 7 churches is saying, I'm going to drop the curtain and show you the spiritual realities about the world in which you're finding yourselves. I want to drop the curtain and show you what Rome is really doing, what Babylon's really doing. Does that make sense? That's what is happening. By the way, this is just a little side note for you, but Revelation doesn't have an S. So I immediately dock students' grades when they put an S on the end of Revelations. It's not. It's just Revelation. Okay? Sorry, that's just a little nerdy thing there for you. Did you know from about the period that this book was written, so within about a 200-year period, and by this I mean if I go to 200 BC and 200 AD and just limit to the time frame of the book of Revelation, we have to date 37 of these that have survived. Apocalypses. Now, the reason that's impressive is almost nothing that was ever written in the ancient world survives, because it's written on paper that doesn't survive, and it depends on these things being copied down and having copies of copies and does that make sense, right? So to have anything from the ancient world, to have anything written from 200 BC is an amazing thing that has come down to us from history. And we have 37 of these. What does that tell you about it as a genre? It was popular. And Jews knew how to read this. In fact, Christians knew how to read this. And Christians loved this genre of literature. So there are Christian apocalypses, Shepherd of Hermas. And I tell students this, if you want to know the book of the Bible that almost made it into the 27 books of the New Testament canon but didn't quite make it, Shepherd of Hermas is the one that's first out. It was beloved by Christians. They read it everywhere. Christians loved apocalypses. What this tells us is that ancient Jews and Christians knew how to read this genre. Does that make sense? We struggle with this because when was the last time somebody for fun sat around and read 4th Ezra or 2nd Baruch or Apocalypse of Abraham or Shepherd of Hermas? Is this actually the first time you're hearing of Shepherd of Hermas? Right? We've never read any of this stuff. And so we have no idea how this genre works. This is like someone 2,000 years from now picking up a Once Upon a Time and having never read one of our fictional books and just being like, what am I doing? What, dragons, princesses? Are you with me? Right? The only other sections, there are a few passages in the Old Testament like Isaiah 24 to 27 that are minor apocalypses embedded within prophetic books. The second half of the book of Daniel would be within this apocalyptic genre. And for those of you that have ever read Daniel, we love the lion's den and we love Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Here, can I go on one little side tangent about the book of Daniel? They would be mortified to know that we're calling them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because those are the names that are given them in Babylon, that embedded within those names are actually Babylonian deities. They would be mortified that we're calling them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that point to God. So that's just a side little thing for you there. We like that part of Daniel, right? We don't like the second part because we have no idea what to do with that because it's all the crazy vision apocalyptic stuff. So we skip that. We do Lion's Den and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, but we skip the second half because that's the only other part in Scripture that you can go to find anything like what's in the book of Revelation. But my point is people in the ancient world knew how to read this. And so what nerdy scholars like I do is go and read all of these because if we want to understand how an apocalypse works, we need to read the other apocalypses. Does that make sense? Right? And 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch and Apocalypse of Abraham are not talking about China and Russia or Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Does that make sense? Right? And I don't think anybody in these 7 churches who knows how to read this genre is going to read Revelation in a way that they wouldn't read other apocalyptic works. And if you want to understand how Revelation works, go look at the other apocalypses because it's a genre. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, John tells you at the beginning, this is not easy to see in English, but he actually tells you how apocalypses work and how this book works. He says, Jesus Christ has made it known. And in Greek, this is actually our word for sign. So in Gospel of John, all the miracles of Jesus are called signs because signs are symbols that point to something else. So John tells you if you want to understand how to read the book of Revelation, everything that's about to be in here is a sign that needs to be understood. Does that make sense, right? That's how apocalypses work. Now, there's a couple of times that John does this, and we wish that he would go through and do this through the whole book, but he doesn't. And it's like, come on, man, help us out, right? But these are... there's enough of these in there to kind of get a sense of what all of the signs or the symbols in the book are doing. So, for example, in the opening vision, Jesus Christ, you see this incredible vision of the exalted Christ, and it says that he is, John sees the 7 lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands are the Son of Man. Well, then a couple verses later, verse 20, he says, as for the mystery, the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. He tells us what that one sign means. Does that make sense? Now, couldn't he have done this for everyone? Come on, man. But at least he's training you to say, anytime I encounter any sign in here, I need to be asking, to what reality does this point? That makes sense? Okay, what reality does this point? Here's another one. In his right hand he held 7 stars. As for the mystery of the 7 stars you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. He tells you. There's another one in chapter 17. He says, I saw the beast. I tell you the mystery of the woman who's seated on the beast with 7 heads. This calls for a mind of wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Now, isn't that wild? The 7 heads of the beast represent 7 mountains. I wouldn't have ever gotten there. That makes sense? But he's telling you that whenever you encounter some strange imagery in here, some symbol, you need to be asking, to what does this point? And you will, tomorrow morning in class, I'm going to do a class on how ancient Roman coins help us read the book of Revelation. Can I whet your appetite? We're going to see some coins today because we have to. Because again, this message in this book is geared towards these 7 churches. This is a very visual book. The first century world is not a reading culture, it's a visual culture. And where do you see the propaganda of empire the best? On coins. Coins are the emperor's billboard. And what was Rome in the first century? It was the city set on 7 hills. And the mythology of Rome is that the goddess Roma, who was their sort of national goddess, their sort of imperial goddess, who's empowering Rome, here's their coin. Do you see the inscription under it? Here is the woman seated on 7 hills in the world of the first century audience. And let me tell you this, Revelation's going to come along and say, she is not a goddess, she's a bloodthirsty harlot. Now, I grew up with this vision. I grew up, you tell me if you've ever heard this, I grew up at my church hearing that Revelation was like the secret code that John had to write in to get it off the island of Patmos, and it was secret code so that no one could understand what he was writing. Anybody else ever hear that? I heard that. This ain't a secret code. You with me? The beast's heads are 7 hills on which the woman is seated. This is not a secret code. In the first century world, you know exactly what this image is talking about. Does that make sense? The woman is seated. And by the way, in the coin here, hard to see some of these down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And here she is seated on 7 hills. Most apocalypses, if you did read 4th Ezra, Apocalypse of Abraham, had my class do an exercise the other day where the vision that's in Revelation 4, there's almost an exact vision that is almost all the same imagery in 4th Ezra and Apocalypse of Abraham. They're all doing similar things. And how do they do them? They communicate through symbols that involve images and even ancient myths. There are usually animals and colors and numbers and symbols and other everyday entities. In Revelation, most of the images, symbols, colors, and numbers, they come from the Old Testament, but there are some that very clearly come from the world of the 7 churches. And so the key question that I think knowing that Revelation is an apocalypse causes us to ask is, to what reality or truth does this sign or symbol point? That's what I'm trying to help students to begin to see. And while I do read Revelation differently, I'm a Christian, and so I read this as a word from God. This is Scripture, amen? Right? So there is something in here that Revelation is different. And I'm to read it differently because the Spirit is at work through this book in Scripture to change me and mold me and help me to capture God's vision for the church. But I still have to read it as an apocalypse. And if I wouldn't read 4th Ezra this way or 2nd Baruch this way or Apocalypse of Abraham this way, I probably shouldn't read this book that way. It'd be the same. It'd be no different than me saying, as I'm reading the letters that we have of Paul, how did they write letters in the ancient world? And I wouldn't want to read this as not a letter, because it is a letter. Does that make sense, right? And so with Revelation, we have to read it as apocalypse. Are we to be worried about real frog spirits that are to be roaming to and fro from the world? What about all the judgments? Today, this is one of the things we just won't be able to get to, is all the judgment stuff in the book of Revelation. All the bowls and trumpets. And I wish we could, but we just can't do everything. But let me ask you this, okay? So in Revelation, the bowls, they're plagues. It calls them 1, 2, 3, 4 different times, plagues. And as I say these out loud, any teachers in here of kids' classes, right? As I say these out loud, the experience of painful sores, or might I say boils, seas and rivers and springs becoming blood, hell from the sun, darkness, parting of waters for people to be able to cross through, frogs. Does that sound like anything? What? The Exodus, right? There's Exodus imagery all in the book of Revelation. Now, again, this is where I want to go back to. If you read this as apocalypse and you think that it's all future telling, we're going to read this and we're going to be looking for darkness and hell, and we're going to be predicting these things literally. Does that make sense? I'm telling you that John himself and the way he's constructed this and all of the Exodus imagery is saying you read this and you look back. And what these visions are communicating is in the same way that when God pours out His judgment, what does Pharaoh do every time? Doesn't work. God is telling these Christians, in judgment, these are the hard hearts of the people on the earth. They don't turn to God. And by the way, in chapter 9, verses 20 and 21, in chapter 16, chapter 11, verse 13, in all these passages, what God wants from people is to bring about their repentance. Whenever God judges, it is in hope that people will repent. Does that make sense? And the Exodus imagery is telling you that no matter, by the way, how many plagues are there? When I teach my Story of Israel class, we talk about the 10 plagues. Do you realize every one of those plagues is an act of grace? One should have been enough. There wasn't one, there was 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and then 6. I got kids, and they don't get 10 chances. You with me? How many, there's bowls, trumpets, and seals. Let's do the math. There's 7 of each. I'm not great at math, but that's 21. It's the plagues times 2 plus 1 more for good measure. In the book of Revelation, we read all about wrath and judgment and blood, but actually in the book of Revelation, I think there's an incredible amount of grace and mercy. He gives them double the chances Pharaoh had, plus 1 more for good measure. And ultimately, all of this is to bring about. But I'm getting all this from the Exodus because the book is pointing you back towards there. Does that make sense? Right? What about those locust scorpion horses? And so, this is... Again, are we to be looking for these things? And so you probably maybe have heard this, but there are interpretations of the book that say, well, John didn't understand what he was seeing either, and so what he thought he saw was locust scorpion horses, but actually he was seeing Black Hawk helicopters. These sorts of interpretations. And what I want to say is look at the characteristics here. Look at Revelation 9. These are a couple of examples because this is all we get to do on a Saturday. Just a few examples. And then Michael is going to teach a class on Revelation soon. I'm totally kidding. I just volunteered him for that. Where you can all work through it and see all of this, but this is just some examples. Here's these locust, scary scorpion horse things. Okay. There's locusts like horses equipped for battle. Their teeth are like lions' teeth. There are many chariots with horses rushing into battle. Their names are Abaddon or Apollyon, which is the Hebrew and the Greek for destroyer. Okay? This all comes from Joel. All of it. Look at Joel. Locust, 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 locust. Its teeth are like a lion's teeth. Has fangs like a lioness. They have the appearance of horses, but like war horses they charge. Like a powerful army, they're drawn up for battle, and they're the destroyer. Do you see it? It's not look future to Black Hawk helicopters. It's look backward, because all of the imagery that John is using in this book is taken from the Old Testament. If you squeeze the book of Revelation, the Old Testament will come pouring out. And that's everything. Every line of this thing is somewhere in the Old Testament. But for us, the problem is we do not share that symbolic world of the first century. So symbols and images that they would have picked up on because it's naturally a part of their world, we don't share that, and so it's not always obvious to us how the symbols that would have worked with them should be understood today. Now, I wrote this, and I took all concepts from the book of Revelation, and I made an illustration. I want to read this and see if you pick up on some of these imageries in this, and I want to ask you if you can, at least at the end of it, give me a gist of what this is about, okay? What's the judgment in here, okay? I heard a loud voice, and I looked, and behold, I saw a rider coming from the north on a white horse. He announced to a man clothed in red, white, and blue, standing in front of a giant white house, and said, "Behold, for your sins, I'm bringing upon you earthquakes, wildfires, floods, and tornadoes for your participation in the selling and buying of human souls. You have allowed the beast with 3 heads to plunder the nations. And behold, after 1,776 days, I saw a bald eagle falling from the sky. And behold, I heard a voice of 50 angels crying out in worship to God and the Lamb. O beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plains. O God, please shed your grace on us and crown us all with crowns from sea to shining sea." I just made this up, but all taken from concepts from the book of Revelation. What's the judgment about in this text? What do you hear?
Judgment for slavery.
For slavery. Now, here's why I chose that one. Did you know this? In Revelation 18, there's a list of 26 commercial goods that in the vision are part of Rome's commercial exploitation on the sea. And as Babylon is being destroyed, as this vision of the great city Babylon being destroyed, the shipmasters are crying because they've lost all their money from their commercial sea trades, and it lists 26 commercial goods. There's actually nothing like this elsewhere in the New Testament. Spices and cinnamon and pearls and jewels. And the last item in the list is the buying and selling of human souls. Go look at it. Here in Revelation 18 is a critique of the slave trade. And oh, that we would have heard the message of this book sooner than we did. And so as I embed that in here, that critique is in the book of Revelation itself, in Revelation 18. But as you hear this, because you share my symbolic world, red, white, and blue, giant man in front of a giant white house, right? You share this symbolic world. As I read that song at the very end of this, you knew immediately that that's a song, didn't you? I did that because in the book of Revelation, did you know there's 15 hymns? There's been no book that's inspired more of our hymns and our songs in the book of Revelation. In the book itself are 15 hymns. And I'll tell you my hunch on why that is as we go through this seminar. My hunch is this, because in the first century world, to worship the emperor, they actually had, particularly in Asia Minor, they had traveling choirs that would go around and sing worship to the emperor. And my hunch is that what Revelation is doing in those 15 hymns is taking things that they would have said in worship to the emperor and reorienting those to that you're singing worship to the one who truly is deserving of that worship, the one who's on the throne and the Lamb. Make sense? That's my hunch on what those hymns are doing. Did you notice how I changed the song just a little bit? The focus of the song is not, "Oh, America, America." It's, "Oh God, oh God." It's changing that song just a little bit to reorient it to be about God. Does that make sense? I think that's what Revelation is doing itself. As I talk about, what about 1776? You know. Now, what's fun is to do this in class, because in my Revelation class right now, I have a student from Zimbabwe. You know who this is here at this church, don't you? Archford Manduvi. I have Archford in class in Revelation right now. And I have a student from Ukraine in class with me right now. And when we read this, They don't see all of this. They don't see 1776. They don't see Rider on a White Horse. They don't see Robert E. Lee. Do you know what I mean? Right? We're trying to read the symbols that are given to a culture that would have understood all the symbols. And that's one of the challenges in the book. And so we do have to do a little bit of reading. I think the best example of what Revelation is in our modern, if we had to say what is one genre in our modern world that might compare to what Revelation is, I think it's closest to what we would call a political cartoon. If I were to say today, how many of you are elephant or donkey? Don't raise your hands, please. I'm going to be hard on politics today, so you go ahead and get ready for that. Are you of the elephant or the donkey? And you know what I mean by that, right? Because that's part of our symbolic world that we all share. I think Revelation is engaging in those images. This is a political cartoon from Andrew Jackson, and he's slaying the beast of the Federal Reserve, of the many-headed monster of the Federal Reserve. And when this was published, they understood what this represented. And in the same way, I think this is what Revelation is doing in its world. So what is Revelation? Apocalypse, prophecy, and letter. And I think it's really important to understand these three to orient ourselves to the message of what the book is doing. Are you with me? Let's take a break, and when we come back here in just a few moments, we're going to talk about the 7 oracles to the 7 churches, okay? Thank you so much. We ready for session 2? We got to keep this thing moving if we want to eat at a timely manner and get through 290 slides. I will make this service announcement. I'm seeing some of you take pictures, and I got a question at the break. I am happy to share the PowerPoints with Mike, and then if you want to go to him and get them from him, I'm happy for you to do that, so you don't have to take a picture of every slide. So I should have said that at the beginning. So
I'll just use them for my classes.
Perfect. All right, well, in this section, we're actually going to look at the section that probably, if you have any familiarity with the book of Revelation, it's these 7, we call them 7 letters to the 7 churches. I like to call them oracles. I think they read like prophetic oracles. Like in the Old Testament, when Ezekiel or Isaiah is giving an oracle to a nation, this is what it looks like. So I call them 7 oracles, but if I'll probably accidentally slip into calling them 7 letters, and if you call them 7 letters, that's fine to me too. But the 7 oracles to the 7 churches. So these churches are located in what is modern-day Turkey. So this is Turkey right here. And they're over there. In fact, if you look right here, do you see Izmir? Do you see, this is kind of, do you see Z-M-I-R, Zmir? Smyrna. This is the modern-day version of the ancient city of Smyrna. And so even modern-day Turkey, some of the cities in Revelation have left their impact even on the names of some of these. So the 7 churches are over here along the coast in Asia Minor. So we've just gone to ancient provinces in the Roman Empire, and this over here is the province of Asia Minor. And these are the 7 churches over here along the coast. Now, if I go back to this map, what do you notice about the strategic location of these cities on this particular coast? They're port cities in one of the largest provinces in the Roman Empire in the 1st century. These are wealthy, successful, thriving cities in 1st century Roman Empire. Now, if you look at the order of these in the book of Revelation is Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, which are the major 3 along the coast. Then you have Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. These are the cities in the order in which Revelation lists them, because do you notice down here, here's Patmos. So as John is not the one delivering the letter, he has written this prophecy, and he is likely sending it with one of his brothers, the prophets that he mentions in chapter 22:9. I think this is hilarious. In chapter 1, verse 3, John says, Blessed is the one who reads this, and blessed are those who hear it. Because in our modern world, as we read the text, we forget in the ancient world, everyone who encountered this would have heard it. It's being read to them. And I love that John embeds in chapter 1, verse 3, a blessing on the poor soul who's going to have to go read this crazy thing to the 7 churches, right? Bless this guy. In Alabama, we'd say, bless his heart, right? Okay. But as this poor soul has to travel from Patmos, where's he going to start? And so the order of the 7 oracles, 7 churches, is actually the order in which it would have been delivered and read. So it follows the actual order in which the letter is being delivered and read amongst the 7 churches. Now, one thing to know about these 7 churches is, if I go back to this slide, do you see that Laodicea is actually right here next to Hierapolis and Colossae? So in your New Testament, you can actually see Colossae from Laodicea. It's less than 10 miles, flat ground. You can stand in Laodicea and look over and see Colossae. Today, if you go there, you can see this. They're all really close to one another. In fact, some of these cities you can see from the other city is how close that they are. Make sense? Okay? I love coins, as you can tell. I think they're really important. These cities printed a series of coins called hominoia coins. And hominoia is a Greek word that we might translate into English as unity coins. And these cities were all in cahoots with one another because they're all in the same province. They're all close to one another. And so for me up in York, Nebraska, it would be like me talking about Seward, Nebraska, and Geneva, Nebraska, and McCool, Nebraska, and Grand Junction. Now, all those cities that I just listed in Nebraska, do you think they're very different from York, Nebraska? I would try to name cities around here, but I don't even know where to start because I'm not from Kansas. I've never been here. So I'm not going to try. But in other words, cities that are really close to one another in the same geographical area are probably dealing with similar kinds of things. We're not talking about York, Nebraska and New York, New York. They're geographically close, and there's 7 of them. And they actually mint these coins called hominoia coins, and they are used, by the way, to depicting their cities as human beings. This one actually is depicting them as 2 men, but I think all the other ones are 2 women, because a common way to represent cities in the ancient world is through depicting them as being women. So when you see, by the way, the New Jerusalem as a bride and Babylon as a harlot, this is imagery they would have understood. Cities are often depicted as women. So here is Sardis and Smyrna shaking hands. Here is Philadelphia and Ephesus shaking hands in unity. Here is Pergamum and Ephesus shaking hands. Here is Smyrna and Ephesus shaking hands. Now, do you notice one of the common denominator cities here, which is the one that they all want to be shaking hands with? Ephesus, because it's the capital city of the province. It's the largest of the cities over here, so they all want to be in good graces and unity with the capital city, Ephesus. And so in chapter 2, we have the 7 messages to the 7 churches. And we actually know a lot about these churches from the ancient world. So this is a reconstruction of what Ephesus would have looked like. Ephesus is not just important when we talk about the book of Revelation. This is also important for Paul's letters. Paul spends 2 years in Ephesus. And do you see this theater right here? This is the theater which Paul is in the marketplace, and he gets dragged into the theater in Acts 19. And there they come and scream, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for over 2 hours. Do you remember that story in Acts 19? So Ephesus is not just important for Revelation, it's important for the rest of the New Testament. Ephesus is one of the most well-preserved cities archaeologically from the ancient world. It's an incredible place. That's that theater, by the way, seats 25,000 people. Now you ask how they did this in the ancient world without microphone systems. They knew how to build things with acoustics in mind. It's actually really impressive. This is, if I could go back, this is the, see this walk goes straight down right here. This is the city center where the city clerk would have been up here. Here's the walk down. Here's the marketplace, the theater. This is that walk down as you're heading down to the theater. This is me freezing my rear end off in Turkey, because when we went it was supposed to be warm, and they had the coldest week they had ever had. They had their first snow in 30 years while we're there. This was back during COVID, so we all had masks with us, and I didn't take the proper clothes because I was not prepared for this. So I had to take my masks that were for my face, and I had to use them as earmuffs, and it was really, really cold. But this is me standing in that theater in Ephesus. Pergamum is one of the most incredible cities that I didn't know was incredible. before seeing it. Here's the Acropolis on the top of Pergamum. It's unreal. This is what it would have looked like at the time that this would have been written. By the way, you take a tumble down this theater and you're gone. Gotta be careful there. You walk around these cities and there are inscriptions. One of the things on this inscription, do you kind of notice this right here? Notice this right here? See this right here? This is called Damnatio Memoriae. And after you die, if the Senate says so, they will erase your memory from the world. And this happened to several emperors, Claudius, Domitian, Nero. After their deaths, their memories were erased from the world. And so the inscriptions that had originally been to them, you might wonder now why Revelation might say things to people like, your names will be written in the book of life and will never be erased. Because in the first century world, your name could be erased. And this was something that people walked around with sort of this existential dread. But these are the kinds of things that when you walk around the sites and you see some of these things, we actually have a pretty good idea of what life was like. This is Laodicea, one of the most well-preserved cities from the ancient world. The digs that they've done at Laodicea are incredible. Now, if you stand right here on this temple, it's a glass floor, so you can see this old temple that's actually underneath it. If you look over here, so it's off screen, but if I'm standing there and I look to my right, so if I kind of look over this direction, if I'm standing facing that way and I look over here, I can see Colossae. It's just right over here. Do you see back over here? This is Hierapolis. You see that white right there? What do you think that is? What? A lake? It's a calcium bath. Somebody said that. This is Pamukkale, and it's calcium deposits. Now you wonder, these are hot water coming up out of the natural hot springs. Now you wonder why Jesus might say something to the church that literally is in constant view of this. Hot water and cold water, and you're lukewarm. Right? Because this is in their world. They know this. This is a message that is to them, and even Jesus' words to them are contextualized to their world and to their particular situations. It's amazing when you go see Pamukkale. It's incredible. This is there in Turkey today. I have to do a little pitch here that we lead tours over to see these places. So if you want to walk in these places and stand in those hot baths, come talk to me and get on our information list. Okay, there we go. There was our... Here's something I need you to know about these cities, because let me go back to say this. What's happening in one city is likely happening in the others. They're all in close proximity. You can see them. They're all unified. They're all in Asia Minor. Does that make sense? So when we see these cities, what's happening in one is likely happening in another. And so one of the things I need you to know about the ancient world, and Asia Minor in particular, because I think this is so helpful to understand the book of Revelation, is this thing called imperial cult, because we don't have it as prominently or as obviously something like this in our world because we're not pagan and we don't share their symbolic worldview. It's called the imperial cult, and it simply refers to the worship of the emperor. Now, the imperial cult in Asia Minor was strong, and let me give you just a brief snapshot of the history here. Okay, so we got to go back to Julius Caesar. So let's see if there's any history buffs in here, right? So Ides of March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar is assassinated, right? And it starts this long period of civil war because who's going to be in control? And so it ends up being Mark Antony and his girlfriend Cleopatra, right? And he's fighting against Julius's kind of adopted son, Octavian. They're kind of opposing each other, right? Do you remember this, or is this all new for you? You need to go watch a documentary or something. Review your history here. So Octavian and Mark Antony and Cleopatra are fighting each other. And Octavian's kind of based in Rome and has the military. But guess where Mark Antony and Cleopatra set up their opposition? All the senators who are supporting Mark Antony in this civil war, guess where they go and set up their opposition to Octavian? Asia Minor, Ephesus. Ephesus becomes the seat of the rebellion against Octavian. Well, who ends up winning in this thing? Octavian. So who's been the seat of the rebellion against the newly minted emperor? What does that maybe mean for Ephesus, Pergamum, Smyrna, and these cities that backed the wrong horse in the Civil War? Does that make sense, right? What does it mean for them when it's over and Octavian is now the new emperor? Uh-oh. So in the late 30s BC, so this is after the Civil War and Octavian is now the new emperor. In the late 30s BC, a delegation goes over from Pergamum. By the way, before Ephesus becomes the capital, Pergamum was the major city because until 129 BC, Pergamum was a kingdom. It was the capital of a kingdom. It's called the Pergamonese kingdom. So Pergamum was the major one, and then when it's taken over by the Romans, Ephesus becomes the major one, but they're both major cities. Well, they all send a delegation over to Octavian. They say, Octavian, we are so sorry for backing Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Would you please, please, please let us set up a temple to worship you? That's what you have to do, right? You just lost, you backed the wrong horse. Please, Octavian, let us set up a temple. By the way, Octavian ends up taking the imperial name Augustus. So the first emperor, as we transition from a Roman republic to a Roman empire, Augustus is the first. That's Octavian. Please, Augustus, let us worship you. Augustus, being the humble emperor that he was, he said, okay, I'll let you worship me. But only if you worship me alongside the goddess Roma. And so worshiping, why is that strategically smart for the new emperor who's just coming out of the Civil War? It ties worship of him to worship of the state. And so now to be disloyal to the emperor means to be disloyal to the state. Does that make sense? He's smart. He's strategic. So he says, I'll let you build this temple, but only if you worship me alongside Roma. And so the first imperial temple, cult temple that is built to worship the emperor outside the city of Rome is in Pergamum, and it's been there since 29 BC. So wherever you date the book of Revelation in the second half of the first century, wherever you put this thing in the dates, this thing's been there for 100 years, just about. You with me? Where is the seat of emperor worship outside of Rome? It's in these 7 churches. Okay, when we talk about an imperial cult temple, what this means is that the Senate has approved this is a temple to worship the emperor. When the Senate approves it, they're using Roman tax dollars to fund this thing. The high priests and the sacrifices and the temple, it's all built from Roman tax dollars. That's why it's a big deal to get a Roman imperial cult temple. There's not any others outside of Rome. The first one's Pergamum. Second one is built in 26 AD, and the third one is built in 89-90 AD, and these are the first 3 imperial cult temples built outside of Rome. They're all in the first century. And let me ask you, do the cities Pergamum, Smyrna, and Ephesus ring a bell for you? Where is the seat of emperor worship outside of Rome? It's in Asia Minor, and it's in these cities in particular. Make sense? Now, outside of imperial cult temples, you could have any city could set up emperor cults. You could set up your own as long as you're paying for it out of your own pocket. The imperial cult temples are Senate-approved, tax dollar paid and funded. You could set up, and we know there are myriads of local emperor worship temples in all of these cities, everywhere you go. In fact, in these cities, you can't worship Artemis, Apollo, you can't worship any of them without worshiping the emperor alongside them. That is what it means to live in Asia Minor. And there's kind of a historical story for why this happened. Again, coins. This is, by the way, if you go to Pergamum today, we don't know where this temple was. We know it was there, but they've never uncovered this temple. This is a coin of Augustus. And here he is, Mr. Humble himself. Roma. You see R-O-M? That's Roma, et, Latin for and then August. The goddess Roma alongside Augustus. And guess who is funding this coin, who very proudly puts their name on the coin? The commune of Asia. They're proudly the seat of emperor worship. Here's that same temple. Here's commune of Asia. Here's Rome et Augustus. And here is, by the way, the goddess Roma, and she's putting a crown on his head, Augustus's head, as he's the king. Do you see it? Okay. I love to tell the story of 26 AD because I think this is funny. Remember a couple of years ago when all these cities in the U.S. were trying to vie for the next headquarters of Google? You remember that? And everybody was like sending delegates to the Google headquarters and like trying to get the next Google headquarters in their city. They had the same thing in 26 AD. Tiberius says, you know what, it's about time we get another imperial temple over there in Asia Minor. So he holds a contest, and every city is allowed to send a delegate to make their case for why they should get the temple. And so 4 cities were immediately disqualified. There are 11 cities that go over to compete from Asia Minor to get this imperial temple. 4 were immediately disqualified, one of whom is Laodicea. They were not wealthy enough to be worthy of having a temple. Pergamum already had the first imperial cult temple in 29 BC, so since they already had enough, they disqualified them because they didn't need 2. Already we got 2 of our 7. What are they there doing in 26 AD? Please let us have this imperial cult temple. You see it? They remove another 2, Ephesus and Miletus, because they already had incredible temples. Ephesus had the temple to Artemis. So the choice came down to 2 cities, Sardis and Smyrna. Those sound familiar to you? 5 of our 7 cities are here in 26 AD begging for another imperial cult temple. And it ended up being won by Smyrna, and they get the second imperial cult temple in 26 AD. I think this is so important because looking ahead, the central image of the book of Revelation is the throne. It's 47 times. I'm going to go ahead and tell you this. The central question of the book of Revelation is, whose throne are you at? And in their world, whose throne are they tempted to be at? The emperor's. So, this is why this is important, these 7 messages. If anybody knows anything about the book, it's probably these 7 messages to these 7 churches. I want to do a little bit about the opening of the book of Revelation now. I want to go back and talk a little bit about the opening. So look at what are the first things that are said about Jesus Christ in the book. Right out of the gate, who is Jesus Christ? He is the faithful witness. If you can, be here tomorrow for the sermon time, because the sermon time is going to be on the theme of faithful witness. Because the central message of the book, and when I mean central, I mean it both literally and metaphorically. The actual central chapter in the book, right in the center of the book, where everything in the front part of the book is leading up to it and everything in the second half of the book is coming after it, is chapter 11, which is about the 2 witnesses. That's the central message. So if you say you get one sermon to preach on Revelation, it has to be on this because it's the central message. So come tomorrow to the sermon time for that. And the first thing out of the gate about Jesus, He's the faithful witness, He's the firstborn of the dead, and He is the ruler of the kings of the earth. And them's fighting words. Do you see why this would be the first thing that's said of Jesus right out of the gate? To these cities? Who are they struggling with thinking is the ruler of the kings of the earth? It's the emperor. I should have asked this. Don't look. Should have asked this first. Where do you think all 3 of these titles for Jesus comes from? Thank you. You're learning the Old Testament. Actually, now, who said it? Where in the Old Testament? That's a good guess. This, you would never, Ezekiel's another great guess. This is actually, you'd never get this. Psalm 89. Again, it's just dripping. Where do these 3? By the way, I think this is I think you can tell the story of Jesus with these 3 titles. Jesus comes and is God's faithful witness and is willing to die for His testimony to God as God's Messiah. And so as a reward for Jesus being a faithful witness, He is the firstborn from the dead. And when He's raised from the dead, He's seated at the right hand of God on the throne with God and is ruling over all the kings of the earth. You can tell the story of Jesus in these 3 titles. Amen? My goodness, it's good stuff. We don't even have to go past verse 5 to get a gospel sermon. Amen? And then this crazy Jesus, by the way. So John, all the introductory stuff, and then I turned to see the voice of the one who spoke to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white as white wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters. And in his right hand he held 7 stars. And from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. And his face was like the sun shining in full force. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Now, when you close your eyes and think about Jesus, do you think about Jesus having white hair, white as wool? Do you think about Jesus having a sword coming out of his mouth? Do you think about Jesus as having eyes of fiery flames? By the way, I have to tell you this random thing that I had never heard of, but at York University, Kay Magner, some of you may know Kay Magner, I don't know, she came up to me and said, I got to tell you this story from when I was in college. She said, this Jesus right here, is this Jesus pretty startling? Right? Pretty startling Jesus? She said, when we were doing campaigns in college, one of the missionaries who took us down somewhere in Latin America, she said the men in Latin America, the missionary told us, were very kind of macho, and they didn't like the meek and mild Jesus who's always got a lamb on his shoulders. So they actually printed off these huge buttons with Jesus with fire coming out of his eyes and a sword in his mouth. It's this from this passage. And they wore these huge buttons around all week on their mission trip to try to appeal to the more macho men. I just thought, that's crazy. Like, okay, there's your random tidbit for the day. Where do you think when we close our eyes, I mean, if Jesus dies in his 30s, he probably doesn't have white hair, white as wool. Where do you think all of these images come from? Thank you. You're learning. They come from Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 9. So I saw the Ancient One. By the way, in the Old Testament, who's the Ancient One in the book of Daniel? God. Saw the Ancient One, and his clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool, and his throne was fiery flames, and a stream of fire issued and flowed out of his presence. And then Daniel chapter... I went up, not down. I knew I was supposed to go to Daniel 10. And here you see a golden sash around his waist, and his face was like lightning, and his eyes were like flaming torches. Do you see all the elements? The fiery sword comes from Isaiah 49, like a sharp sword coming out of my mouth. I want to make this point really quickly. Sometimes I'll have to go on tangents because we can't really go there. A lot of people have the imagery of the book of Revelation that it's very bloody and that Jesus kind of walking around with a sword, that he's chopping off people's heads, and they see this as a very violent book. I love the subtitle of a book by Matthew Street called, I can't remember the Lamb, something in the title, but the subtitle is Violent Pacifism in the book of Revelation. The sword that Jesus wields is never in the book in his hand. It is always in his mouth. And in Isaiah 49, what do you think this metaphor of a sword in your mouth is referred to? It's the power of the message of God when you proclaim it. In the book of Revelation, Jesus never has to fight with a physical sword because he's already won, and all that Jesus has to do is proclaim his victory. And so his word the word of his victory is as good as a sword in your mouth. Is that you with me? I had a student one day in class say, in chapter 19, when Jesus is on the horse and he's killing people with the sword in his hand, and I said, stop, nope. He never has a sword in his hand. I just want to make sure that you see that image. I think it's actually really important. He gets this from Isaiah 49 as well. There's one thing in this section, though, of Jesus that is not in the Old Testament. I could have tricked you, but I chose not to because I still want you to like me. I could have said, where does this image come from? And you would have said, the Old Testament. And I would have said, wrong. That doesn't happen often, so I have to really use those. This is the one imagery that's nowhere in the Old Testament. So where then would you guess, based on just our introduction today, where might we look then to find what this image might have meant in their symbolic world? Things that are around them, right? Things that come from their world. And when we do that, here is a coin minted in the reign of the Emperor Domitian. And on this side is actually one of Domitian's deceased children that died in childbirth. And he puts this child on a coin. What's the child seated on? a globe, you realize, please do not ever believe that we're the first people to recognize the world was round. Romans knew this. In fact, in the 3rd century BC, the Greek Eratosthenes had calculated the circumference of the world within just a couple hundred miles. I mean, it was actually miraculous what he was able to do. In the 3rd century BC, the Romans knew the world was round, and they actually depict, they call it the orbis terrarum, which is the orb. They know that it's round. So as Domitian is depicting his child, here's his son seated on the world. This is an image of world domination. Do you see it? And what direction is the child facing? The right, and he's holding out his right hand. Do you see it? And there's 7 stars. And one of the, I think, reasons for this is that they also knew back then that there were planets. And it was kind of within the Roman knowledge that, or belief system, that there were 7 kind of heavenly bodies out there beyond the stars. And so this is an image of world domination. And this image, in this imperial propaganda image, who is it that's seated on top of the world who holds the whole world in his hand? It's the emperor. Here's another one. This is Tiberius. He's got his right hand extended. And do you see 7 stars? This is an imperial image. When I say that Revelation is going against the messages of empire, what I'm showing you as one example is a microcosm of what I think the whole book is doing. These folks in these cities are tempted to misplace their worship at the wrong throne. You hear me? And so what John is doing is saying, it's not Augustus who's got the whole world. It's not. The person who has the whole world in his hand is Jesus Christ. And what John will do in this vision is he'll take images that people would use for their Caesar, for their king, and he'll say, he's not the rightful king who's worthy of that kind of worship. No. This is true of Jesus Christ. He's the one who's worthy of that kind of worship. What's interesting about this, by the way, I think the book of Revelation has some of the highest, fancy word here, Christology, or teachings about Jesus. The other one is the Gospel of John. John just says it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You know this, right? That's one of the highest statements in the New Testament about the divinity of Jesus Christ, right? Revelation has those same high statements of divinity of Jesus Christ. It just doesn't come out and say it in a plain way. It says it through symbols. So depicting Jesus as having, the risen Jesus as having characteristics of the Ancient One from the book of Daniel. Who is the Ancient One in Daniel? So if some Jew walks around and starts talking about some other person having the characteristics of the Ancient One of Daniel, they say, blasphemy! That's God. You don't use those characteristics. But if he's using them for Jesus, what's he saying through the symbols? He's fully God. The other thing you have to pay attention to are the titles. So God is called the Alpha and the Omega, and so is Christ, the first and the last. God is called the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and end. Christ is called at the end, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and last, the beginning and end. So if you say it's blasphemy to say anybody else is the Alpha and Omega unless they are fully divine. Do you see it? It's making the same high divine statements about the divinity of Jesus. It's just doing it in a little different way than John 1 and 2 is doing it. Now, if you're in these 7 churches, okay, let's go back to these images of Jesus. He's holding the whole world in his hands. He's the first and the last. He's been raised from the dead. He has a sword coming from his mouth. His eyes are like fire. His feet are like burnished bronze. He has the keys of David. He's the faithful witness. That is a little different image of Jesus than John 10 walking around with a little bitty, itty-bitty lamb on his shoulders, right? Whatever we want to say about the Jesus we just saw in these passages, it's not a Jesus you want to mess with, right? And where is this Jesus? He is in the midst of the lampstands. And you know this because John told us the lampstands are the churches. This image of Jesus that starts out the book ought to wake you up. Make sense? And then when you see this startling Jesus, where is he? Oh, He's been walking around your church. Uh-oh. So what are the 7 messages? And by the way, all these characteristics here, when it says the one who has the 7 stars, every one of these introduces and points you back to that Jesus that we just met in chapter 1 in that vision. Does that make sense? That same startling Jesus that should have awoken you from your slumber now has something to say to your church after He's walked around and taken a look. Uh-oh. Now, this is where the book of Revelation starts like hitting us in the gut. Got to preach sometimes. If you find out Jesus has been amongst you and has something to say to you, the presence of Christ can either be unsettling or comforting. If you're doing what you're supposed to, it can be comforting to know that Jesus is with you. If you're not doing what you're supposed to, it can be unsettling to know that Jesus is amongst you, right? That is what is happening in these 7 oracles, is that they are getting a report of what Jesus saw when He walked around and took a look. Make sense? Now, let me tell you what I think is one of the most important interpretive principles to the book of Revelation. This is, I think, key. The vision of chapters 4 to 22 is geared towards the issues that are happening in these churches that we're about to learn about in chapters 2 and 3. Jesus, so let me just do the little, here's the overview of Revelation. Chapter 1, startling Jesus. Oh my goodness, look at Him, the Ancient of Days, the one who's fully divine, burning eyes and white. He walked around and took a tour of our church and saw how we were acting and saw what our lives are about. And now Jesus is telling us what He saw, the good and the bad. That's chapters 2 and 3. He's telling us what He saw when He was with us. And then 4 to 22 is, and because of what He just told us that He found when He was amongst you, here's the vision that's going to set you straight. Does that make sense? When He walked around and took a look at you, here's the vision that's going to set you straight to fix the things that Jesus says you need to fix among your churches. So if you only know one thing about the book of Revelation and you only know the message to the 7 churches, that's actually really, really important, because the function is they tell you the issues that the vision that Jesus gives. Remember, Apocalypse is Jesu Christu. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ. This is the revelation in chapters 4 to 22 that Jesus is giving to address the situations that He has seen when He was amongst them. Does that make sense? So what are the churches facing? What are the issues? I wish we could do this, but we don't have time. I wish we could do it. It would be fun. I did it with my class the other day. So I'm telling you, college students did this. It's great. We broke up into 7 groups, and every group took a church and had to go through and read, is Jesus saying good stuff or bad stuff? And there's 2 churches that get no bad word. There's 2 churches that just get kind of affirmation, but the other 5, a lot of negative stuff, a lot of stuff to fix, right? You read them? And here's what started to happen in class the other day, is that when this group over here said, well, I have Ephesus, and here's what I'm seeing, another group would chime up and say, hey, we're seeing the same thing over here. And this goes back to, remember our hominoia coins? What's probably happening in one church is also happening in another church. Make sense? And you start to realize that there are actually 3 things that seem to be happening in these churches. And they get mentioned multiple times. And I'm going to see if you can help me or that you don't already recognize these yourself. First thing that's happening in these churches is that they are facing conflict with outsiders. And this varies amongst the churches. So this varies from verbal harassment. So Philadelphia is just receiving some verbal harassment from a local synagogue. So this is likely a Jewish non-believers in Jesus are slandering Jewish and Gentile believers in Jesus. And so there's kind of just verbal harassment happening here. When we go to Smyrna, though, it ramps up. It's a little bit more than just a verbal harassment. He actually tells people in Smyrna, you're going to be put into prison for 10 days. Now, when we read that, do Jews imprison people in local cities? So who's behind this imprisonment? It's the Romans. So local government officials. You with me? But then we go to the next level, and in chapter 2, verse 13, in the city of Pergamum, we learn about a guy that we know nothing about. This is the only time he's ever mentioned. It's the only time we ever hear anything about him. We know nothing about his backstory. We have no details on why this happened or how it happened. We can make some really good educated historical guesses, but in Pergamum there was a guy named Antipas, and he was martyred for his faith. And guess what he is called in chapter 2, verse 13? A faithful witness. What was the first thing said of Jesus in chapter 1, verse 5? Faithful witness. What does it mean to be a faithful witness? You do what God has, the mission that God has given you to do, and you lay down your life for it if it comes to that. Make sense? So you have different levels. We have verbal harassment, we have denouncing to lawmakers, we have imprisonment, interrogation, and we actually even have a martyrdom that's happened within these churches. Antipas in chapter 2, verse 13. At the end of the first century, persecution in these cities and in the empire, don't think that it was like the Roman emperor is mandating that all Christians be persecuted. It was not like that at the end of the first century. It was local and it was sporadic. It just depended on local leaders and what was happening in those particular cities, which tells us why Antipas was martyred in Pergamum, but it's not like heads being chopped off everywhere. One guy that we know of. It's local and it's sporadic. Now, in the book, who's behind the persecution? On one hand, at least in Philadelphia, it's a Jewish synagogue who's behind the harassment. In Smyrna and Pergamum, it's the Romans behind it because there's imprisonment and chopping off heads. Does that make sense? So Jews and Romans are behind. But Revelation wants to pull the curtain back and actually have you to have a wider perspective to say the person who's actually behind all of that is Satan. Make sense? In fact, he says Antipas is martyred in the city where Satan's throne is. And so who's behind Antipas losing his life? Satan is the ultimate bringer of this persecution. And this persecution would have come from local and provincial or even imperial rulers. So that's number one, conflict with outsiders. And if one church is having it, don't you think the church right up the road is having it, right? We see this in multiple churches, okay? Number two, here's a second thing happening in these churches. Assimilation, compromise to Greco-Roman religious and cultural practices. Now, where do we see this? We actually are told, it was so funny. I just love watching students like light bulbs come on in class. I just love it. You can see it happening like in the moment. I love it. That's why I teach, for that rush. Whatever a NASCAR driver gets when they I get that when I see a light bulb come on in class. And the first group in Ephesus, they had to report to our class, there were false apostles in Ephesus? And another group says, hey, we got false teachers too. There's at least four different false teachers or groups of false teachers mentioned within these churches. We only got 7 churches, and we've at least got 4 groups of named false teachers in these churches. You have false apostles in Ephesus, and you also have, and we don't know the backstory here, we wish we did, the Nicolaitans. They are a group that follows the teachings of a guy that must have had the name Nicholas. That's a common name in the ancient world. Who was Nicholas? What was he teaching? We don't know. But Jesus is like, shame on you for being a part of the Nicolaitans who follow the teaching of Nicholas. But then we find out that 2 churches, Pergamum and Thyatira, actually have let these false teachers come in who are given names from the Old Testament, Balaam and Jezebel. And what do Balaam and Jezebel do in the Old Testament? They lead God's people astray by trying to get God's people to participate in idolatry. Make sense? So our best guess on what the false apostles and the Nicolaitans are teaching too is the same thing that Jezebel and Nicholas are teaching, and it lists 2 things. Look at chapter 2, verse 14 and chapter 2, verse 20. Eating meat sacrificed to idols and practicing sexual immorality. Both of these things have to do with, if you're a Christian in the first century and you give your exclusive allegiance to God and to Jesus Christ, that means on Friday night, can you go down to Artemis's temple and just kind of hang out and go to the parties down there on Friday night? Now, I'm 36, so I wouldn't go anywhere on Friday night, but it would be hard to be a Christian in the first century because you miss out on everything that everybody else is doing. And there would have been a temptation to say, well, maybe I'll go just have a little bit of the meat. One thing you need to know about the ancient world, by the way, is that you couldn't go to the market and there's no sacred secular divide. If you ate meat in the ancient world, it had been sacrificed to one of the gods. The reason you got to purchase meat was because that bull was offered to Zeus. And then they carved it up, and that's the meat they're selling in the marketplace. Let me remind you, by the way, Paul has to spend 2 whole chapters to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10 all about this issue of what do Christians do when it comes to eating meat. Because you can't eat unreligious meat in the ancient world. It's impossible. And so these false teachers, Jezebel and Balaam and maybe the Nicholas and the false apostles, they're encouraging Christians to maybe go and participate in these kinds of things. And to kind of say, well, it's not that big of a deal. I know we're following Jesus, but not that big of a deal. Does that make sense? And so the last one, the third thing that we see in these churches is they're kind of growing complacent in their faith. Let me see if you can help me with some of these. Sardis claims to be alive. He says Sardis claims to be alive but is actually dead. And to Ephesus he says, you have lost your first love. You know this one, right? What does that mean? They kind of take that zeal that they had for each other and for the Lord, they've kind of taken some steps back. Make sense? There's 2 that I think are contrasted. In Smyrna, this is one of the good ones. In Smyrna, they are materially poor, but they're spiritually rich. The contrast to that is Laodicea, and it's like he saves Laodicea for last. Laodicea just gets lambasted. He actually quotes something the Laodiceans are saying. The Laodiceans are saying, I am rich, I have prospered, and I am in need of nothing. And he says, actually what you don't know is that you're poor and pitiable and naked and miserable. Ow! And this is where he says, you're neither hot nor cold. Now, by the way, let me just make sure you know this. Hot and cold are both good things. You want to be either hot or cold. They're both good. If I go out and really exercise and I get a glass of really, really cold water, isn't that the best thing ever, right? If it is a really cold Nebraska night and I go get in a hot tub, that is awesome. Isn't that right? You know, hot water and cold water both have their purposes. But if I go in our York University cafeteria and I get a lukewarm cup of coffee, I want to spit that out faster than any, right? Hot and cold are both good. It's lukewarm that's disgusting. And Jesus says, you've become like lukewarm to me. And so several of these churches have become complacent. Now, if we had to say why they've become complacent, if you could go back to the first century, outside of Rome, Ephesus is one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire. It's the capital city of Asia Minor, and all things economically, everything in these cities are going well. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum are the major cities, and for the ancient world in terms of populations, these are massive cities. Everything's going great and quite easy. Quite honestly, life is easy. Does that make sense? I am rich, I've prospered, I need nothing. And if you can say something out loud like, I am rich, I've prospered, and I need nothing, then one of the things that gets included in that nothing is the Lord. Make sense? I actually think there is a logic to these 3 things. If you're being harassed and persecuted for your faith, isn't it kind of easier to back away? Does that make sense? If you know that if I'm bold in my faith for Jesus, it might result in me being over in Smyrna and thrown in prison or being like Antipas, having my head chopped off, if you know that that might be the reality for you, isn't it easier for you to kind of back off your first love a little bit? Does that make sense? Isn't it kind of easier as you're backing away to kind of say, well, if I'm going to kind of back away from this Christian thing, I might as well go over here and hang out on Friday night in the Idols Temple and eat some of that meat. Does that make sense? Do you see the logic of the 3? That's one effect that persecution has on people. Persecution has 2 different effects on people. It can either reveal who's really strong in their faith, or it can reveal the people who can't take the heat. And so what's happening in these churches as conflict is ramping up is they're saying, well, let's just kind of, I would rather live in ease and comfort over here than be all out in my faith and be persecuted over here. Does that kind of make sense? There's a logic to these three that's happening in these churches. Now, in the book of Revelation, there's actually 3 vice lists. You know one of them, unfortunately, because of a horrible song that I was taught at camp when I was growing up. Revelation, Revelation, 21:8, 21:8. Do you know what I'm talking about? Liars go to hell, burn, burn, burn. Oh my goodness. Well, in 21:8, there's actually a lot more than liars there. There's actually a lot more than liars there in these 3. And look what 2 of the threads that bind the whole thing together in every vice list is idolatry and sexual immorality. Do you see it? This is a major emphasis of the book. Now, let's put 2 and 2 together here. And let me ask you this. Let's go back to what we talked about a moment ago. And if they are being massively tempted by idolatry, in Asia Minor, we cannot talk about idolatry without talking about worship of the emperor. You cannot go down to Roma's temple without it being the temple to Roma and Augustus. You can't do it. Do you see it? This is a major thrust of the book, is going against this idolatry, which in their minds and in their world is intricately tied with emperor worship. Now, we can't get away from this. We've talked about all the problems in the church, but look at the things that Jesus actually identifies as positive things in these churches. And by the way, these are going to be some of the major themes of the book, of the vision, because what Jesus is trying to do is to get the churches to do more of this. Instead of complacency, wholeheartedness. Instead of faithlessness, faithfulness, faithful witness, and ability to bear up in your faith under suffering. Instead of being deceived by false teachers, to be people who are of the truth. Instead of soiling your garments with sexual immorality, to be people who practice holiness. Do you see it, right? It's like all the positive traits are things that they're being praised for that kind of contradict or the opposite of the things that they're being lambasted for. Now, this is where I want to go back to my thesis statement and to say this. My thesis statement to you was, I think this is the most relevant book for our cultural moment. You remember me saying that? Let me repeat to you what the 3 things are that these churches are facing that the rest of this vision is going to address. They are facing pressure from people outside the church and in their culture, and even increasingly from people around them and even from their government. Do you find as a Christian living in our country today that we are increasingly facing pressure from people outside the church? They are tempted as a result. They are tempted to accommodate to culture, particularly when it comes to worship of the gods, idolatry, and sexual immorality. Do you think that we live in a culture where Christians are tempted to accommodate to culture when it comes to things like idolatry and sexual immorality? Thought there'd be a louder amen there, but okay. Do you think it is also true that at the time when Jesus most needs people who are bold in their faith to proclaim truth, that as we look around us, Christians are growing complacent because life is so easy and because we live in a nation that gives us all of this wealth? And so at the same time that Jesus most needs His church to be bold in their faith, we're growing complacent and backing off. This is the most relevant book for our cultural moment. Not in the sense that it's making specific one-to-one future predictions about geopolitical events that are happening in America. It's because, in the words of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. And the same word that the startling Jesus needed to speak to wake up His churches in Asia Minor in the 1st century, I think Jesus is speaking this word to us to wake us up in the 21st century. Because America is not that different from Asia Minor. That's what when people come up to me and say things like, "Can you believe the things that are happening today?" Study ancient history. And whatever you want to say about anybody, I don't care if you're talking, and I'm an equal opportunity offender here. So I'm an equal opportunity criticizer. So whether we're talking about Barack Obama or Donald Trump, their worst day is not as bad as any of the emperors of Rome. And yet, this is precisely the time in history that the church is thriving and growing. Because, I'm getting on to the sermon tomorrow. The central call of the book is that what Jesus most needs his people to be are faithful witnesses in a world that has been deceived by Satan. And instead of being complacent, instead of giving in to the wealth of the age, instead of accommodating to our culture, we actually need people who are bold witnesses, even if it means we have to suffer and die for it. That's the message of the book of Revelation. Let's take another break and come back in a couple minutes. All right, why don't we try to do our last session before lunch? We've been staying pretty on schedule, so let's keep doing that because you don't want to miss lunch, I know. Thank you so much again for this has been great. I love it. I hope you see that I am just like in my element and I love this. So our next session, again, we can't talk about everything. And so I tried to pick 4 that I think are some of the most helpful. So right now we're going to do, I think this kind of gets you to the heart of what Revelation is doing. I tell students in class, and I'm seeing this happen with them in real time, that Revelation is very confusing, but once you get over that learning curve, once you see how the book is working, kind of the overall thing that it's trying to do, once you get over the curve, then it gets easier. And so we're going to look at what I'm calling the Trinity and the Unholy Trinity in the book of Revelation, and I wish we could camp out on all of it, but I thought that you might be most interested in looking at chapter 13 and 666, and so that's usually the main question. So we're going to kind of camp out there here, and then after lunch, we're going to look at the way Revelation ends in chapter 21 and 22, because I think it's fitting to end our time together with the way the book ends with such a beautiful vision of the New Jerusalem and the new heaven and new earth. And so that's our plan for the rest of our time together. That means we have to leave a lot on the cutting floor. And I'm sorry about that, but that's the nature of the beast. That's a pun. Okay, all right. The Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, right? You know this, and the Trinity is here in the book of Revelation. You see Father, the one on the throne, and the Lamb who's seated on the throne with him, and you see the Spirit doing lots of things in the book of Revelation. But then in the book of Revelation, what most people don't realize, there's actually a plot. First exercise I had students do before we even talk about our first class is the first day of class. I give them this homework assignment, and they love this when I do this. I want you to go read the entirety of Revelation in one sitting. They love that. I'm just totally kidding. They don't. But I just want you to journal what was your impressions after sitting down with the whole book in one sitting. And I think most people who do that, and I know it was true for the students that I have, they leave and they're like, this book is all over the place. This thing is confusing, a bunch of random stuff here and there and all over the place. Actually, there is a real high-level design and even plot to the way that the book of Revelation works. And what it does is there is the Father, Son, and Spirit in the book, but there's also an unholy Trinity in the book. And the leader of the unholy Trinity in Revelation 12:9 is the great dragon, who is also the ancient serpent, who is also called the devil and Satan, who is also the deceiver of the whole world. In case you're confused who the villain of the story is, you get like 6 different ways to say Satan in Revelation chapter 12, verse 9. He's the leader of all the things that have gone wrong in the world. Remember back to your oracles to the 7 churches. Who's actually behind the persecution that they're facing? Whose throne is in Pergamum, right? It's Satan. Revelation is dropping the veil to reveal these spiritual realities that are happening within their world, and it's Satan who's behind all of this stuff. And then in chapter 13 is where you get to the two beasts. You have the seven-headed sea beast, and you have the land beast, who also shows up in Revelation. And what you actually begin to see as you compare these is what Satan loves to do is try to take the prerogative and steal people's worship away from the Father to himself. And so the way that he's done that is he has empowered the sea beast, who is essentially doing and functioning in the same role that Jesus Christ is, because God, the Father, has taken the Son and seated him on his throne with him. So in chapter 13, what does Satan do with this seven-headed sea beast? He gives him a throne to combat and to pull people's eyes away from the throne of the one seated on the throne and the Lamb. And then the same thing that the Spirit is doing within the book, the land beast is doing within the book. So there's actually this high-level kind of Trinity and unholy Trinity happening. And the way Revelation works, and a lot of actual individual passages work this way. We'll see one in chapter 21 and 22. Chapter 14 particularly works this way. Revelation is really a choose-your-own-adventure. You ever played one of those games or something where it's like, you choose which road you're taking on this next adventure? And as a kind of on a macro level, Revelation's a choose-your-own-adventure in which Trinity are you serving? And if you're serving the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, then you're going to be rewarded with the bride. But if you choose, through your choose-your-own-adventure, to serve the unholy Trinity, then you're going to receive the prostitute. Does that make sense? And so there's kind of this symmetrical structure. Even within this second half of the book itself, there is another kind of structure. Do you notice this? We have A, B, C, C, B, A. They're brought in one by one, A, B, C. They're taken out one by one, C, B, A. Do you see how structured it is, right? And so the second half of the book has to do with this main cast of characters: Satan, the beast, and the sea beast. Now, I'm just going to show you this in miniature because we don't have time to look at all these. But throughout the book, the things that properly belong to God, to the one seated on the throne, the things that properly belong to them, Satan and the other two beasts try to take those things. So, for example, in chapter 1, verse 4 and 3:21, right out of the gate, we're told about this throne. And the throne is the central image. 47 times in the rest of the book. It's the central image of the book. And so guess who is trying to set up a rival throne on the earth to rival the throne of God? Satan. That's the plot that's driving the book, actually. God is the one who is and who was and who is to come, which is a bizarre phrase, right? So later in the book, the beasts are going to say that they are the one who was and is not and is about to. Make sense? Trying to take things that only properly belong to God and apply them to themselves. The Lamb is standing as if slain. And the Lamb has 7 horns. And so the beasts, they also have horns. And we're going to talk about this later. But the beasts seem to have been slain, but yet they live. Do you see how that kind of contrasts with each other? You got horns, and one was slain, but yet lives, and the other has horns and is slain, but yet lives. And I love this line in chapter 13, verse 11. One of the beasts has 2 horns like a lamb. One of the tactics of the beast is to try to dress up like Jesus. There's a warning embedded within this. There are sometimes wolves in sheep's clothing. And how do you know the difference? Because that ... if it said what's the rest of it, which we're going to look at actually in chapter 13 in a moment, so I don't even know why I'm saying it now, is it looks like a lamb, but when it opens its mouth, it talks like the dragon. Appearances can be deceiving. You actually have to listen to the content of what's coming out of someone's mouth. Does that make sense? Isn't this good stuff? My goodness. Okay. The Lamb has redeemed a people from every tribe and language and people and nation. The beasts are trying to take every person from every tribe and people and language and nation. The Lamb is redeeming people from every tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, and people from every tribe and people and language and nation are standing before the throne of the beast. Which throne? Which multitude are you in? Choose your own adventure. Every creature on earth is singing to the one seated on the throne and to the Lamb, but with the beasts, all the whole earth is worshiping the dragon and the one who's on that throne, and all the earth and its inhabitants are worshiping those beasts. Where is your worship? The Lamb has conquered, standing as if slaughtered. The beasts also conquered, but here's what's interesting. The Lamb conquers by being slaughtered. The beast conquers by slaughtering. This book of Revelation is going to picture two different ways of what it means to win. And one way to win is the way of Jesus, and the way that you win in the way of Jesus is you die. Make sense? The way that you win in the way of Rome is you kill. Two different visions for what it means to be conquered. The Lamb is the ruler of the kings of the earth, but it's Babylon who rules over the kings of the earth. It is the Spirit who is the spirit of testimony, who is telling the truth, and it is the second beast, or also called the false prophet, who is the spirit of false prophecy out in the world. All of the incredible jewels that you're probably familiar with in the New Jerusalem, they're also the jewels that Babylon is trading on the sea in chapter 18. New Jerusalem, this is a choose your own adventure. We'll talk about this after lunch, but the nations have a choice whether they're walking in the New Jerusalem and the kings of the earth are in the New Jerusalem, or whether they are in Babylon. You see it? It's all the way through. Which one will you live for? So what the plot line does is it unveils what's really going on in the world, and it presents readers with some stark alternatives. You can either serve the Father or the dragon. You can either serve the Lamb or the beast. You can either listen to the voice of the Spirit or the false prophet. You can either live for the economy of New Jerusalem or the economy of Babylon. Which throne will you worship at? Do you see it? There's a plot line to the book. I want us to look at the two throne visions in the book. We're going to look at the throne vision in chapter 4 and 5, and we're going to look at the throne vision in chapter 13. So this is, buckle up. You ready? We got to look at both of these because they're actually designed to be two counter throne visions to one another. So at the very beginning, first thing out of the gate, grace and peace to you to him who are before his throne. So right here at the beginning, before we even launch into the book, we get a mention of the throne. And then the last thing that is said in the oracles to the 7 churches, the very last thing, to the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself have conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. By the way, the only way you can sit on the throne with the Father is if you're fully divine. I mean, to say that someone has ever sat down on the throne with the Father would be blasphemy unless you're divine like the Father. Does that make sense? It's another explicit high Christological statement of the divinity of Jesus. So at the very end, if you conquer, you get to sit with me and the Father on the throne. You get to give a place with me on my throne. And so then right after this is kind of held out as a carrot, to the churches. If you can conquer, if you can do what I'm asking you to do, here's the throne. So guess what the next thing is? Chapter 4, verse 1. I looked up in heaven, and a door was standing open, and the first voice which I heard speaking to me was like a trumpet and said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." And the first thing that he sees is the throne. Now, even this phrase right here, where do you think the influence of this passage comes from? The Old Testament. In Ezekiel says, "The heavens were open and I saw visions of God." Now, I think John particularly is kindred to Ezekiel because Ezekiel is one of the prophets who's a prophet during Babylon. If you look at Ezekiel chapter 1, Ezekiel is by the river Kabar. John is by his own body of water. He's out on Patmos in the middle of the ocean. Ezekiel saw visions of God. John saw visions of God. So he just really conceives of himself as being like Ezekiel. And Ezekiel really influences the book of Revelation. let's see. Okay, let's read this. At once I was in the Spirit. And I'm going to go ahead and stop here and ask you, where do you think this comes from? Every time Ezekiel sees something in the book of Ezekiel, he's in the Spirit. And it's by the Spirit that he sees his vision. See it up there? Okay. I was in the Spirit, and in heaven stood a throne. I want to make this point here, and I just want to say this. If we had to sum up, what is the thread binding all three of the issues? Remember, conflict with outsiders, complacency due to wealth. Do you remember that? All three of our issues, cultural assimilation. What's the thread binding all three of those things together? These churches have taken their eyes off the throne. Make sense? And so as the response to the issues happening on the ground in these churches, what's the first thing they need to see? I call this the centering vision. The first thing they need to do is reorient their eyes on the throne. And that's what chapters 4 and 5 are doing, is showing them the throne that they need to refix their attention to because they've lost their gaze on the throne of God. So he says, there's a throne, and there's one seated on the throne. And the one seated on the throne looks like jasper and carnelian. And around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. The images in Revelation are bizarre. Have you ever seen a rainbow that looks like an emerald? Emerald is green, right? Am I right about that? Isn't emerald green colored? A rainbow by nature is multicolored. So how could you have a rainbow that's emerald? Okay, anyway, there we go. And around the throne are 24 thrones. And seated on the throne are 24 elders, dressed in white robes with golden crowns on their heads, and coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God, and in front of the throne there is something like a sea of glass, like crystal. Now, I want you to notice all of these details. We have a throne of God. It looks like jasper and carnelian. There's a rainbow that looks like emerald. Coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumbles and peals of thunder and 7 flaming torches and a sea of glass like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and back. And the first living creature, a lion. Second living creature, an ox. Third living creature, a face like a human. Fourth living creature, like a flying eagle. The 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings and eyes all around and inside. And day and night, they do not cease singing, Holy, 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 the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Where do you think all of these images come from? Old Testament. This vision is modeled almost creepily off of Ezekiel 1. And if we had time, I would love to do it. I would love to do this, to break up into groups, and it's what we do in class, and I love these things. But go read Ezekiel 1, 4-28, and you will see almost every detail that we just talked about. The 4 living creatures with the 4 faces come straight from Ezekiel 1. The eyes, the weird eyes on front and back, come straight from Ezekiel 1. All these details. By the way, on the throne in Ezekiel, there's a rainbow. And guess what color is also mentioned in Ezekiel's vision? Emerald. And all those things, everything that I just pointed out to you, the details come from Ezekiel. We have to keep looking back to the Old Testament. The only thing that doesn't come from Ezekiel is the note that they have 6 wings. And this song that they sing, Holy, 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 the Lord God Almighty, that actually comes from Isaiah 6, verses 1-3, where you have the seraphim that have 6 wings, and they're singing this exact song in Isaiah 6. So it's kind of a combination of 2 visions that 2 prophets in the Old Testament have. John has a kind of a mixture of the 2 visions that 2 Old Testament prophets had. You with me? Now, another fun experiment that I love to do. I should have thought to do this, and I would have made Mike do it if I would have thought. Bring a whiteboard up here, and you read Ezekiel 1, 4-28, and you ask Mike to draw it out. If you try to understand what's happening in Ezekiel 1, you are going to drive yourself crazy. You ever heard that song? Ezekiel saw the will. He saw that will. Okay. With the eyes all over, and like, what is happening in Ezekiel 1? That's a crazy, crazy vision if you try to read Ezekiel 1. what scholars think is happening is Ezekiel has seen something so crazy, he even has a hard time writing it down. But what he's probably seen is if God took his throne and put it on a mobile home and got out of Dodge. And what's probably happening, seriously, is that God is taking his throne and making it mobile, and these living creatures are like the horses pulling a chariot that has God's throne in it, because Jerusalem has become so sinful that God has been kicked out of his home, his temple, so he leaves Jerusalem, and he actually goes and visits the exiles who are out in exile. And that's what Ezekiel's prophecy is. In the Old Testament, is God is gone, he's taken his show on the road, and he's going to visit the exiles who are over in exile. But John is seeing something very, very similar to this. And so whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to the one who's seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall before the one who's seated on the throne. So what do the elders do? They fall. And they worship the one who lives forever and ever, and they cast their crowns before the throne, singing, "You are worthy, O Lord, our Lord and God, to receive glory and power and honor, for you created all things, and for by your will they existed and were created." Do you remember our question that I said is a healthier question to understand Revelation? Whenever you get to a symbol, you should ask, to what reality is this symbol pointing? Now, we sort of wish John just always told us, right? That when he says the 7 torches, 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. We wish he did that with everything, but he doesn't. But when you come across a symbol, you're supposed to be asking, what does this symbol represent? So what do these 4 living creatures represent? And I actually think we make this one much harder than it needs to be, because in the book, I think it's embedded within their name. They represent living creatures. And how do we know this? Because what do they sing? You created all things, and by your will all things were created. They represent all things that have been created. Now let's walk through them. There's 4 different living creatures. We have an ox, which represents domesticated animals. We have a lion that represents wild animals. We have an eagle that represents the birds. We have a human that represents the creatures. This is kind of standard Jewish thought, that in heaven there are things that are happening in heaven, and what we wish were happening here on earth were the realities of the things happening in heaven. Does that make sense? In fact, Jesus teaches his disciples to orient their lives around the prayer that says, may your kingdom come and on earth be done as it is in heaven. That's a standard Jewish way of thinking, that God is up there, and what's happening up there in heaven, we wish that were happening here. Does that make sense? And so they're seeing a vision of the kind of things that are happening in heaven. And so what's happening in heaven? In heaven, we're being shown all living creatures worship the one who is around the throne. I teach a class at York called Creation Care. And what we talk about is when God created this creation, it is very good. When a tree gets up and does its tree thing every day, it is praising its creator, right? When a bird gets up and does its bird thing, it is praising its creator. All creation is oriented towards worship of the creator. In the Old Testament, it'll say the trees clap their hands. Amen? Right? Now, we've lost the awe of creation, and we need to recover that. But when you look out at at the creation, when all of creation is doing what God created it to do, it is worshiping its creator. Whether it be a domesticated animal or a wild animal or a human, all creation, rightfully ordered, ought to worship its creator around the throne. That's Revelation 4, right? This is the vision that he sees. And so then he sees these 24 elders who are seated around the throne. Well, what do these 24 elders represent? What do their 24 thrones represent? And I would say, again, that what they are is embedded within their name. Who, for those churches, just like I'm imagining here at this church, who or what are elders? They're the leaders, right? They're supposed to show, the people of God are supposed to be following their lead. Does that make sense? And the fact that there's 24 of them, whenever you have a number 12 or a multiple of 12 in the book, it usually is a number that represents the people of God. And that makes total sense, because in the Old Testament we have 12 tribes, and in the New Testament we have 12 apostles. And so 24 is a great number to symbolize these are the leaders of all of God's people. And as a church here, by the way, you ought to be following your shepherds. You ought to be following your elders. Make sense? Right? So the creatures show us what all of creation ought to be doing, but the elders show us what all the Christians, the followers of Christ, ought to be doing. You follow your elders. And so what are the elders doing? Now, are there elders in this room? Show of hands. Okay, several elders in here. I was in full-time ministry for 13 years, and I grew up with my dad, who's an elder, so thank you so much for what you do, because it is not easy. And I know nothing about this church, so I can say whatever I want to say and then leave. And I hope you all make it easy for them to be shepherds, amen? Don't be a problem. It's not easy to be an elder. Well, in this vision, amen, right? No, I'm just kidding. In this vision, these elders have made it. They got their throne and their crown. They did the hard work of being an elder, and they made it, and they are sitting right there next to the throne of God. They have made it. They've done it. You see that, right? But what's the first thing they do? These elders can't get up fast enough off that throne and get that crown off their head and fall down before the feet of Jesus, because these elders have lived their whole lives falling before the throne of God and leading people to the throne of God. And when they finally make it, they take the posture they've been taking in their entire lives, which is falling before the throne. This is actually the job of what all shepherds ought to do. They ought to lead people to the throne of God in worship. Make sense? So the living creatures show us what all of creation's doing, and now these elders are showing what all of the people of God are supposed to be doing. What are we supposed to be doing? We're supposed to be worshiping the one who's on the throne, just like these elders are leading us in. So what I like to say in the rest of the book, these elders and these living creatures, whenever you see them anywhere, they can't help but worship. I call them the worship leaders of the book. Whenever you need a worship break or something in the book, whenever you're like so pumped up you just need to take a worship break, that I guarantee you the elders and the living creatures are going to show up and lead you in a worship break. That's what they do. And so I don't think, however, anybody can hear this vision of falling before a throne and putting your crown before the throne. No one in the first century is able to hear this vision and not hear imperial court behind you, because what is the throne that everyone in the first century is going and bowing down to present their crowns before? Whose throne is it at? And the living creatures and the elders are trying to reorient these folks that that's not the throne that we go and bow down before. It's that throne. Does that make sense? It's powerful. It's important. It's reorienting their gaze. Now, remember when I talked about the thrones and remember that weird stuff like fire and a rainbow, like an emerald and sort of all that stuff? You remember all that? Where in the world would you go in the first century where you might actually see something like that? And oh, by the way, what if it's actually printed on their money? What if this is the emperor's throne and behind it looks like a rainbow, or at least an arc, and you actually have flames of fire shooting off the top of it? And yes, John is drawing on visions from Ezekiel, but what's the message for them? This is not the throne to be in front of. Do you see why coins help us read the book of Revelation? What about this one? What about that weird rainbow that's the color of an emerald? What happens when a coin oxidizes and gets that patina on it? This throne, by the way, has bolts of lightning coming off of it, which is also in the book of Revelation. Which throne are you supposed to be at? And Revelation saying, not this one. This is Michael Gorman in this textbook. He says it better than I could. What this vision shows us is that the worship of God is the heartbeat of the cosmos. Even when we humans on earth do not see it, participate in it, or value it, only God is the one who is worthy to receive what others, especially powerful political figures, may want or demand, our total devotion, our praise, and our crowns. But they only belong to God, who is seated on the throne. So in chapter 5, look what happens. He says, "Then I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll, and it's written on the inside and the out. It's sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?' But no one in heaven and on earth was able to open the scroll or look into it." And so John begins to weep bitterly because no one can open the scroll. And so John is shown a scroll, and God has written a message on it. But unfortunately, it is sealed with 7 seals, which is way overkill. Way overkill. And John's like, who in here would receive a message from the Lord and not want to know what it says, right? John's like, I want to know this thing, but there's no one worthy to open the scroll. I saw in the right hand of him, notice this detail, the right hand of him seated on the throne, a scroll written on the inside and the outside. This scroll, by the way, where do you think this comes from? Old Testament? Look at Ezekiel. I looked and I saw a scroll. It was a written scroll from God. It was written on the front and the back. Do you see it? Now in Ezekiel 3, guess what? After this is Ezekiel 2 and Ezekiel 3, guess what he's told to do? God gives the scroll to Ezekiel and says, "Eat it." What a bizarre thing to do. So I opened my mouth and he gave me the scroll to eat the scroll, and he said, "Eat this scroll." And when it filled my stomach, it was in my mouth as sweet as honey. This is Ezekiel, right? Guess what John is told to do in Revelation 10? The scroll shows back up. Take it and eat, and in your stomach it will be sweet as honey. And he ate it, and it's sweet as honey in his mouth and in his stomach. Do you see all the... It's Ezekiel 2.0. It's in Revelation chapter 10. So in Ezekiel, here's I think this is a powerful metaphor. If God has written this message and he eats the message, what has he done? He's ingested it so that now he's taken on that message within himself. And this is what the scroll means in Ezekiel, that everything that's going to follow after chapters 2 and 3, every word that Ezekiel's going to speak is the message of God coming out of his mouth because he's ingested the message of God in himself. I think there's actually a powerful metaphor in this image for us as Christians. The reason we need to be engaged with and immersed within Scripture is because as we ingest it, then out of our mouth come words of life. Does that make sense? And so the scroll is very important in the book. In fact, John is so great at getting you on the edge of your seat. Chapter 5, this scroll shows up. And you want to know, what in the world has God written on this thing? What is God's plan for the world? What would the creator of the universe write in this scroll? Well, you're going to get to wait 6 chapters until you find out. And what I get to tell you today is you have to come for the sermon tomorrow. Because all those overkill seals, they get broken in chapter 6, 7, and 8. And there is a pattern to, by the way, the seals, the bowls, and the trumpet. There's this pattern where the first 4 go like boom, boom, boom. And then 5 and 6 get a little bit longer. So the first 4 are the 4 horsemen. So the first boom, 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 they're quick. Then 5's a little bit longer. Then 6 is a little bit longer. And then John says, we need a praise break. And so all of chapter 7 is an interlude. And you're like, come on, man. Break that 7th seal. I want to know what it says. Come on. But we got to have a praise break, chapter 7. And then chapter 8, you finally break the seal, but you don't see the scroll with all the seals now popped off of it until chapter 10 again. And this is where John then takes the scroll and eats it. He ingests the message. And then chapter 11, 1 to 14 is the content of the scroll. Does that make sense? Now, the content of the scroll then is going to dictate what the rest of the vision in chapters 12 to 22 is about, because it's in the message of the scroll in chapters 11, 1 to 14, where you have the first mention of the beast. And you're reading that and you're like, what's the beast? Well, that's chapter 13 and the rest of the vision. Does that make sense? The rest of the vision plays out what the content of the scroll is. It's really important. So he went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who was seated. Here's a picture of just like a replica of it, but I, in all my research, have found, I think there are 2 instances where they've actually found from the ancient world a scroll with 7 seals on it. This one dates back to 335 BC. They found it. And this is a picture from 1963, and you'll never be able to see it with the seals. I mean, there'll never be a better picture taken because they took this picture and then they actually broke the scrolls to open it so they could see what it said. So like you can't go back and retake a picture or see, an unbroken 7-sealed scroll. So they've actually found some of these, so we do know they're in the ancient world. This is actually research that I have that's ongoing. The one seated on the throne who takes a scroll in his right hand. Hello? This is the emperor, seated on the throne, scroll in his right hand. Now, I think the key to this is actually a coin minted. I'm going to San Diego next month to present this research. Like, no one who talks about Revelation has ever talked about this coin, and I'm going, hello? After Augustus restores order after the Civil War, and he wins over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and he does restore order, this is a coin that he had minted from the imperial mint with him on the throne with his scroll in his right hand, and the legend says leges et iura restituit, which is Latin for law and order restored. I think in the book of Revelation, if this image is in the background of the reader's minds, the fact that Jesus is the one who's worthy to take the scroll means that it is through Jesus Christ that God is restoring law and order and justice to the world. That's why He's the judge. That's why He's the just judge. Now, in their world, who's the just judge who's holding the scroll in his right hand is restoring law and order to the world? It's the emperor. Do you see how all of this is emperor stuff, right? It just all keeps coming back to this. And in this context, he says, Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. The root of David has conquered. Root of David, that's a messianic imagery from the Old Testament, by the way. Passages like Isaiah 11. Lion of the tribe of Judah comes from Isaiah 49:9. I'm not going to treat you like kids. I could keep saying it. Where does everything come from? The Old Testament. And now, I don't know about you, but I had a membership to the Memphis Zoo, and lions are scary. You could, in the Memphis Zoo, when that lion would be close to eating time, the lion would do that, You could hear that from wherever you were, anywhere in the zoo. It's scary. One of the devices that Revelation will do is sometimes what you see or hear is clarified by something else that you see or hear. So if you hear something, you'll turn to see something that clarifies what you just heard. Does that make sense? And vice versa. And right here, John, as an elder, speaks to him and says, see the Lion of the tribe of Judah. The lion, the strong lion, the lion that out in the wilderness is king of the jungle and kills and mangles and dominates, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. But then what John sees immediately clarifies what he sees when he turns is the Lion of the tribe of Judah is a lamb standing as if slain. I would call these two verses not only my favorite two verses of the book, but the key to understanding the message of the book. The way that you conquer and win in the world is by being slain. Does that make sense? The way that you exhibit strength like a lion is you die. Does that make sense? Jesus redefines for followers of Jesus what power looks like. Now, what does this do for Christians on the ground? Antipas, who lost his life, I really want you to think about this. You're a Christian in Pergamum. You get together at somebody's house to worship on the first day of the week, and Roman authorities bust in and drag Antipas out of your assembly and cut his head off in the courtyard of your house. And this message says, you know who's the ultimate winner? Antipas. He is the one who's conquered. He is the one who is standing. You ever seen a lamb or a deer that's been slaughtered that's standing? But Antipas is, because he walked the way of Jesus. Make sense? Such an important image here. I'm just going to show you this really quickly. It's an altarpiece at Ghent that was made in 1423, and the central image of the altarpiece is this lamb. Got a puncture wound and blood spilling out there. It's a crazy image. How do you depict this? And it's the central image of the book, the lamb standing as if slain. And so then the four living creatures and the elders, look at what happens. The four living creatures, now that Jesus has taken the scroll and He's going to enact justice in the world, and He's going to bring God's will to the world, and there's finally someone who's able to execute God's will and bring justice to the world. Now that this has happened, worship breaks out. So who would show up? Our living creatures and our 24 elders. So look at what they do. The living creatures and 24 elders fell before the Lamb, each holding a harp, and they're singing a new song. And then in the next section, watch the worship grow. Just watch it grow. The next section, now we have the myriads of angels surrounding the throne. The living creatures are still there and the elders are there, but now they're joined by myriads and myriads and thousands of angels with a full voice. Worthy is the Lamb that was slaughtered. And then the last one, every creature in heaven and on earth. You see how it's growing? It was just the 4 living and the 24, and now it's them plus thousands and thousands and myriads and myriads. And now every living creature on heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them. Now they're all singing, and our worship leaders don't know what else to do but just say, Amen. Do you see it? And at the end of chapter 4, you're supposed to run through a brick wall because you're so pumped to worship the one who's seated on the throne. Do you feel it? The ramping up of the worship. I have to tell you about this grad class, that class that I told you that changed my life, that PhD seminar in Revelation that I had to take with Craig Keener. Craig Keener is one of the most genuine, wonderful professors ever who truly believes in what he's teaching. And I've never had an experience like this in class. We work through these 2 texts together in the worship text. And what I just tried to convey to you a little bit in my excitement of what these chapters are doing and ramping up the worship, what you see happening up there, you're supposed to do here. So if you read these chapters and aren't led to want to go worship, then something's wrong with you. That's what they're designed to do. And so Craig Keener in class is teaching these 2 chapters, and we get to the end of chapter 5, and he's ramped up and he's worshiping, and he says, guys, we have to live this text out right now, and we've got to worship. And Craig Keener goes in the middle of our class and just lays out prostrate on the floor. And here I am, my little church cry self. And I'm like, what do we do? I don't know what to do. Do I need to get in the floor? I don't know. And Craig Keener looks up at a student in our class who is from Africa. If there's one thing we can learn from global brothers and sisters is how to worship. And Craig Keener, I still remember his name, Fasil Woldemarian. He says, Fasil, lead us in worship. And Fasil started praying. And I don't mean he was praying. Fasil was praying. You know what I mean? I've never been in a class before, particularly a PhD seminar, where worship just broke out like that. But Craig Keener said, how can you come to Scripture and encounter this part of the text and not be led to worship? What we're actually doing in that class is what this text is designed to do. And if you encounter the book of Revelation and you're not led to worship the one on the throne and the Lamb, then you're missing the point of the book. You with me? Powerful stuff. But for our last couple of minutes, oh my goodness. Okay, Revelation 13. We may be a little late to lunch, but you got to see it. It's so good. You got to see it. So Revelation 13, this is a counter-throne vision. So I think we're going to read it first. So let's read it first. So we're going to talk about some of it, okay? I saw the beast rising out of the sea. Let me start by saying, okay, chapter 12 is all about Satan, introducing you to the way Satan works. And quite honestly, in chapter 12, we walk around and talk about how powerful Satan is and how great he is. Chapter 12 wants to make an opposite point. Satan is a loser. Satan can't stop the Messiah in his life. Satan can't stop the Messiah in his death. Satan can't even beat an angel called Michael. Satan gets his, rear end destroyed by an angel. If Satan can't even beat an angel, you think he stands a chance against Jesus or God? My goodness, he's a loser. So he goes after the woman. He can't get the woman, who's the father or the mother of the Messiah and the children of God. So the last thing in chapter 12 is he goes after the woman's children, the people who obey the commandments of God and keep the testimony of Jesus, which are the people in the churches. This is explaining to them from a cosmic perspective, why does Satan seem to be ravaging you and why does he seem to be so desperate? It's because he's a complete and utter loser and he's already lost to Jesus. He's already lost to the Father. He can't even beat an angel, and so he's coming after you. Make sense? And then at the end of chapter 12, Satan takes his position on the seashore. And then chapter 13, he calls forth his hideous sea monster. And so a beast rises out of the sea. It has 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horn were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet was like a bear's, its mouth was like a lion's mouth, and the dragon, the Satan, is empowering the throne and giving this beast great authority. One of its heads seemed to receive a death blow, but its fatal wound had been healed. Isn't that interesting? One of its heads, it singles out one head. It seemed to receive a death blow, but it was healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority over to the beast. So you see the chain of custody. What is Satan's strategy to deceive the whole earth? To create a throne and get people to worship a beast on the throne. How do you get people to take their gaze off of that throne? You set up another throne. Make sense? See the strategy? And people worship the beast, saying, "Who is like it? Who can fight against the beast?" The beast was given a mouth speaking arrogant and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to speak blasphemies against God, blaspheming His name and His dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to wage war on the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it, and everyone whose name had not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. Let anyone who has an ear, if you are taken captive, go into captivity. If you are killed with the sword you must be killed. And here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. So I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. There's our verse. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that has been wounded by the sword and yet lived. You heard that before? Something about that head that's been wounded but yet lives. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. It also causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be given a brand on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have this brand, and the name of the beast or the number for its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number for a person. Its number is 666. All right, so let's do this as quickly as we can because it's almost time for lunch, but I'm just giving you a heads up. We're probably going to go 5 or 10 minutes over, okay? To be fair, you all took a long time in the bathroom and we started 10 minutes late. So we're going to just go just a little bit. But I think you're interested in this, right? Let's get a little 666 before lunch. Okay. So who is the first beast? Who is the sea beast? What does it represent? What's its purpose? Do you see we're asking the same questions that we ask of the elders and living creatures? These are the right questions to be asking. It has horns and diadems. It has blasphemous names on all of its heads. It's like a leopard, like a bear, a mouth like a lion. It has throne and great authority. One of its 7 heads, 3 different times, is said to be fatally wounded by a sword, but yet somehow it lived. The whole world worships the beast. Who is like the beast? Who can fight against it? And it wages war and conquers the saints. Now, all these characteristics, the beast coming out of the sea, 10 horns, leopard, bear, lion, where do you think they come from? Book of Daniel. Are you starting to get a sense? My goodness, right? But in the book of Daniel, there's 4 beasts come out of the sea, like a lion, like a bear, like a leopard, has 10 horns. The beast out of Revelation is straight from the book of Daniel. Make sense? Now, even if I had nothing from the book of Revelation that helps me to understand what this beast is, if I just look at what John is pointing me to by making the beast look like the beast of Revelation, what is the beast in Revelation? See it? Okay? Now, this is actually one of those places where in the book of Revelation, John actually gives us help. He says, the 7 heads of the 7 beasts are also, do you see it? John actually tells us the beasts are 7 kings. Now, why 7? Because in the book of Revelation, whenever you have the number 7, it usually symbolizes, you've probably heard this about the number 7, completion or fullness, the whole number of. And then he tells you they're kings. As I read this, he's telling you that the beast symbolizes the fullness of the empire, the kings. And who are the kings of the 7 churches? Who are the kings of the Roman Empire? The emperors. That the beast represents the Roman imperial, the whole thing, all of them. Make sense? And we would know this just because of the fact that he points back to Daniel, and even there, these beasts represents 4 kings. But John tells us in 17:9, the 7 heads are 7 kings. They represent the fullness of the imperial thing, all of them, if you could package them together. And guess what all of the emperors are? They're beasts. And one of the points that he uses to make this is in the book of Daniel, you have 4 different kingdoms that all 4 beasts represent 4 different kingdoms. But in Revelation, this beast is so bad that it has all 4 characteristics of all 4 kingdoms wrapped up into one kingdom. That it increases the beastliness of the kingdom that is before them and the kings that are before them. Every tribe and people and language and nation worship the beast. If it is the emperors, is it true to say in the world of the churches that it's written to that everyone around them in the entire empire is worshiping this beast? That's called imperial cult. Make sense? The second beast appears and makes an image to get the whole world to worship the first beast. What does that tell us about the second beast? It's the machine driving imperial cult. The job of the second beast is to get everybody to worship the first beast, and if the first beast is the emperors, what is that called? Imperial cult. And the number of the beast is 666, and it's the number of a person. And whenever John says something like, this calls for a mind of wisdom, what he wants you to do is kind of lean in because he's about to tell you something you need to think about. This calls for a mind of wisdom. I want you to listen because I'm about to tell you something I need you to think about. The number of a beast is the number of a person. Now, as I understand it, and I actually think the vast majority of scholars today understand it, that the first beast represents the imperial rule. All of the emperors. He says it's the kings, and this is what he represents. And in chapter 13, you actually have a satire on imperial cult. And one head in particular, do you see how it kept zeroing out that one head? That one head, it said 3 different times, it was slain and yet lived. And one said it was cut by the sword and yet lived. Why does it keep zeroing in on this one head? We got to talk about that in a second. But one of the things that it said is that the emperors wore blasphemous names on their heads. Where in the world would you find somewhere where an emperor wears a blasphemous name on his head? I think coins are pretty important to understand the book. One of their titles is Divus Augustus, and not just August went by this title, many of them did. This is Divine Augustus, but the book is making a strong point about who are the only divine ones that are worthy of worship. Not Augustus, but the one on the throne and the Lamb. A title that the emperors went by is Pater, Father. They wore the name Father, Father of the Empire. They went by names like Pontifex Maximus, High Priest. By the way, let me see if I have, I can't remember what all coins I have on here. Let's see here. One of the titles that's on a lot of coins is, do you see this? Do you see Divi and then F? F is Filius and Divi is divine. Divine and F is Filius for son, divine son. One of the most common titles on coins in the emperor's war is Divi Filius, and on their monies they would just print DF for short. It means divine son or son of God. You understand why Romans would have an interest in putting down a Jewish person walking around claiming to be, and others are at least claiming to be the Son of God. That is a title that the emperor had, Son of God. Autocrator is the word for Almighty. Where are these blasphemous names on their heads? Who is like the beast? Who can fight against it? Now, if this is, let's do a thought experiment. If this is the Roman imperial machine and the empire and all the emperors, who in the world in the first century could fight against the military might of the empire? So emperors wanted to make sure you knew this. This is a person, probably a German person, bowing down and offering their shield to this Roman here on this coin. You might not have known this. You know that Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, right? Did you know that Rome actually minted a series of coins called Judea Capta coins? So here is Judea Capta. This is Judea captured. And here's a Jewish person with their head down crying as the Roman is standing victoriously over them. Did you know this? They bragged about this. Who in the world could ever fight against the military might of the emperor? I think a lot of the imagery in Revelation 13 is about Nero. Do you remember he's chopped off, or the head is slain with a sword and yet lived? I have to tell you what happened to Nero. So Nero persecutes Christians. In 64, I got to go through some of this history because we're about to see it. In 64 AD, there's a great fire in Rome. And before that, Nero wasn't crazy. And early in his reign, he was okay, but towards the end, he gets super paranoid. And the saying of the empire was, it would be better to be Nero's dog than his family members, because he ends up having half his family killed because he becomes paranoid. Well, in 64 AD, like a quarter of the city of Rome burns down, and the rumor started to spread around that Nero was up on his rooftop watching this happen, playing his fiddle. And whether that's true or not, it's a rumor. And perception's everything. And so Nero blames the Christians. And so he's one of the worst persecutors of Christians. That's 64. Well, it just goes downhill from there. And by 68, Nero ends up committing suicide. And guess how he commits suicide? He slits his throat with a sword. But the rumor was that Nero had not actually died. And that what he had done is he had gone across the river over to the east to the Parthians, and he was forming an army, and he was going to come back over and take his rightful place on the throne because he actually hadn't died. It's called the Nero Redivivus myth, and you can go look this up anywhere that you want. And actually, I put this picture up there because this is Home Alone, and there's this like Reddit conspiracy that's actually Elvis in this scene. It's not, But you know this about Elvis, right? There's all these like, did Elvis really die? Or is he really alive? This would have been that myth, but for the first century. All these people, all these sources are talking about it. In fact, this blows my mind. Augustine is talking about this myth in 422 AD. He commits suicide in 68, and Augustine is still talking about this in 422 AD. This spread and had widespread significance in the first century. We're not going to read all of these because we're a little bit past time already. But this was such a real myth for the first century that he had not really died and he was really alive, that you have all of these people. This is a slave who actually leads this uprising, and he actually pretends to be Nero still alive, raises an army, ends up getting killed, and they put his head on a tour through Asia and through Rome to tell people to stop messing around with Nero Redivivus stuff. He's not coming back. Here's a person during the reign of Titus who is from Asia Minor and who looks like Nero, and everybody thought he looked like Nero, so he actually went over to the nation of Parthia and started claiming to be Nero and started raising an army over there, and when somebody goes and tells the Parthians about it, they kill him. This is like real crazy stuff happening in the first century. Here's another person in the reign of Domitian who was telling people that he was Nero. My point is, this was a strong myth, and so if somebody in the first century is hearing a beast who is the emperor's, and 3 times one of the 3 heads is slain but yet lives, they know what this is. This is cultural folklore that everybody knows about. Here is the boundary between the Roman Empire and the Parthians, and if there was one people that the Romans were a little bit nervous about, it was the Parthians. And Revelation, I think, plays on these nerves, because the angel pours out a bowl where the Euphrates River is dried up so that the kings of the east can come on over and fight them. You say this in front of any Roman, and that would strike fear in your bones, because the only people you're afraid of is the people on the other side of the Euphrates, the Parthians. Make sense? The beast is allowed to make war and conquer the saints. I told you about Nero's persecution of Christians in 64, but let me tell you 2 of the ways he persecuted them. Because the rumor was that Nero had started the fire, he wanted to blame the fire on Christians. So what he would do is he would throw elaborate parties at night. Roman historians tell us this. This is Tacitus and Suetonius tell us about this. So he would throw elaborate parties at his palace, and he would have people come, and he would hang Christians up in a crucifixion posture, which, by the way, tells us a really important historical piece that by the 60s AD, even the Roman emperor is aware of how Jesus was crucified. So they hang Christians up on these crosses at his parties, and he lights them on fire, and as their bodies burn, it serves as the lighting for his parties. That's Nero. Nero would take Christians and he would dress them up in animal skins, and for fun he would release wild dogs on them. This is Suetonius and Tacitus. The reason I think that this narrative, this part of the vision, only zeroes in on this one head 3 different times, saying that head that's slain and yet lives, you can't miss who it's talking about. The reason it zeroes in on that is, say, if you want to know what the imperial heart looks like, it looks like Nero. Now, Titus and Domitian and Claudius, they might have not persecuted Christians to that particular degree, but if you want to know how evil and how awful the imperial heart is, look at that one head. Does that kind of make sense? It's using Nero to say, and by the way, do you know what the function of this is? Remember what they're tempted to do? Where are they wanting to go on Friday night? Let me go down and just have some of that Domitian meat. Let me just go down and do some of that idolatry stuff. And he says, you want to go have meat sacrificed to the idols? You're thinking about doing this emperor worship stuff? Look at what the emperor has done to your brothers and sisters. And you would consider compromising? Does that make sense? By the way, I think Revelation says it's kind of a fitting end, for the beast is going to burn Babylon with fire. This is what the beast knows to do, and this is what it's done to the people of God. So it's a little fitting he would turn his mania on the woman itself, and then fittingly, the beast is destroyed in a lake of fire. He sort of got what he had coming. This is how he lived his life, and he received that judgment back on himself. Now, we get to the interesting part, and I think this is the last thing. Okay. It says, the name of the beast or the number of its name, calculate the name of the beast, for it is the number for a person. This right here is telling us that to understand what he's saying, he is giving you a number calculation that you're supposed to work out because it is the number for a person. In the ancient world, they had this thing called, you can call it number calculation, or a fancy term for it is gematria. And the way that they do their letters, by the way, the way that they do their numbers in Hebrew and Greek is by letters. And so these numbers have values, and they assign values to these numbers. So in the ancient world, everyone sort of knew, like my name is Garrett, Garrett, and let's say G is worth 50 and A is worth 3, and I know that my name is 732. That's just something you know, like in grade school. Everybody knows their number, and it's just something that ancient people knew how to do that we don't know how to do. Now, do you see on my slide where I say 666 or 616? Do you see that? If you look in your Bible, you probably have a note. I took a screenshot right here of, there's a note right here, 666. There's a note, and if I click on that note, some manuscripts say 616. Now, I think the earliest and best reading is 666, and so all translations are going to go with 666 because I think that's the best one. But I just want us to keep in the back of our mind for a moment that an alternate and even early reading here says the number of the person is 616. Okay? In the ancient world, they knew how to do this. How do I know that everyone in the ancient world knew how to do this? Because archaeology is great. When you go and visit these cities, if you go on our trip with us, if you want to get more information on that, we will go to Smyrna. And they have discovered in Smyrna a basilica where there are graffiti on the wall. So just like go to a gas station bathroom today, people in the ancient world loved to graffiti stuff too back then. And so they had graffiti stuff all over their walls. And we have found all of this graffiti in the city of Pompeii, which was essentially buried in time in 79 AD. Tons of graffiti. There are websites dedicated to all of this. And I would tell you to go read it, except for the fact that just like the potty humor that's graffitied on the gas station bathrooms, the graffiti from the ancient world is that and is gross, and it is disgusting and potty humor, back then too. They had, what do you expect from pagans, idolaters, and sexual immorality? But it's very potty humor. But amidst a lot of this graffiti, look at, I've just chosen 2 examples because I want to make a point here. Look at where I've chosen them from. Smyrna. There's lots of graffiti all over the ancient world, but I picked Smyrna for a reason. They found this. And here's the graffiti right here. And the translation of it is, I love a woman whose number is 616. And I love that because that's one of our 2 numbers, 666 or 616. So you're walking around and you're TK and you know that your number is 616 and you see that and you say, oh, my boy loves me, you know, because he's graffitied my number into the wall. Everybody knows their number and everybody knows how to do this in the ancient world. Here's another one. I love a woman whose number is 1308. This is the way you indicate you love your girl. You know, you love your guy, you graffiti their number onto the wall. This stuff is all over the ancient world. Everybody knew how to do this. Make sense? We don't know how to do it. But here's what most scholars agree is happening with this number, and here's why I'm pretty confident this is what's happening with the number. If we take the Greek name Nero Caesar, Neron Kaiser, and we transliterate it into Hebrew letters, Neron Kaiser, right here, and we add up the values, and Hebrew is written right to left. So Neron Kaiser, here are the values. Guess what? 666. Now, where would we get the number 616? Because if we take the same name and we put it into Latin, and we drop this final, do you see this? Neron. We drop that in. Guess what the value of that in is? 50. That gives us 616. No matter which number it is, it's Nero Caesar. Does that make sense? I actually think the variant reading in the other manuscripts helps you out because it tells you no matter what number it is, it's Nero Caesar. And then when you start putting it together, you go, oh yeah, the Nero Redivivis myth, the head that was slain that yet lives, all the imagery, it makes total sense. And the point of the text is to say, if you worship the first beast, if you give your life to this, you're giving your life to one who's so evil that he would burn Christians, that he would do these horrible, horrible things. That is the real heart of the imperial beast. How would you ever give your allegiance to that beast? Does that make sense? The second beast, I'm just going to tell you, the whole goal of the second beast is to get people to worship the first beast. There are lots of local people like this. We have coins from this guy named M. Plautius Silvanus of Pergamum, and he wants to put that temple of Augustus on his coin because he wants you to know that as in Pergamum, we worship Augustus. And all these local officials, all these business owners, all the local magistrates, if you don't do the imperial worship stuff, that's why you get thrown into prison in Smyrna. That's why you get your head chopped off, because you're seditious. Who are all the local people enforcing this and making people worship the emperor? That's what the second beast represents. Now, what is the mark actually for? I promise we're almost there. I promise. What is the mark actually for? It says that you receive the mark so that you can buy and sell in the marketplace. What are they selling in the marketplace? Meat. And when you go into if you're a Christian and you choose not to do the emperor worship stuff, that has effects on your whole life, because this is what it means to live in Asia Minor in the first century. And so if you choose not to do emperor worship stuff and you choose not to go on Friday night down to the emperor's temple, this is going to impact you. And you're going to be impacted economically even in this life. If you choose the economy of New Jerusalem over the economy of Babylon, you may suffer in this life. Make sense? You may be thrown into prison for 10 days, and if you're a person who's living in the ancient world, how does it hurt you economically and financially to just lose work for 10 days? And so if you worship the emperor and give into that so that you can have financial gain, if you don't worship the emperor and you don't give into that, it's likely that you'll have financial loss. And so here's a beautiful message that Revelation says, that getting the mark of the beast is about being able to buy or sell. And this is one of those places where chapter-verse divisions are unfortunate, because the very next thing that he's going to give them is a vision that reminds them that they have already been bought. You may not be able to buy and sell in the marketplace, and you may suffer economically, but it's okay because you've already been bought by the blood of the Lamb. Isn't that beautiful? Now, I just want to note here that while everybody's looking for 666 on their car tags and on their W-2 tax returns, it specifically says that it'll be on the right hand or on the forehead, right? Where do you think this comes from? Old Testament. This idea comes straight from Ezekiel 9. In Ezekiel 9, you receive a mark on your forehead, and actually in Ezekiel 9, it's a protective mark. You want this mark in Ezekiel 9 because in Ezekiel 9, if you get this mark on your forehead, it means that God will not judge you. All the people who run around worrying about 666, I'm not sure they've realized in Revelation there's actually a counter mark. Everybody's looking for 666, but in the book of Revelation, there's actually a positive mark too, who are marked with the servants of our God with a seal on their forehead. This is a good mark. This mark shows up again in chapter 9, verse 4, chapter 14, verse 1, chapter 22, verse 3 and 4. So all the people who are so worried when they see the number 666 out there in the wild anywhere, I've never heard anybody running around paranoid that they don't have the mark of the seal of the Father on their forehead. Does that make sense? There's actually a counter mark in the book of Revelation. And the reason I think that it picks the forehead here is to say, who you worship will be obvious. People should be able to see who you worship. It should be as obvious as if the name of God or the name of the emperor were written right here on your forehead. Make sense? And you know how I know? Because Facebook. Who you worship is obvious. Make sense? And then I do want to point this out as we close. Revelation adds a detail because in Ezekiel 9, the mark only goes on the forehead, but Revelation makes sure to add that it's on the right hand or the forehead. Why add the right hand here for the mark? And I think it has to do with the mark is for buying and selling in the marketplace. And where are you going to pay your money with the heads that has blasphemous names? Does that make sense? That is where you're going to go and do that buying and selling. We're done. And Mike is going to come make an announcement about lunch. Sorry for taking us over this